As quickly as they came, they left. Stories of Vikings in North America tell of mysterious lands and foreign tribes known only as Skrælings. It was 1000 AD. For nearly 12,000 years, the Americas had been cut off from Eurasia. Civilizations developed on each side without knowledge that the other existed. Nearly 500 years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, the Vikings journeyed to the Americas from Greenland and Iceland, possibly multiple times. And it wasn't very peaceful.
Welcome to Nutty Productions.
Today, we're examining the Viking fingerprints in North America, their clashes with the Native Americans, and why they disappeared almost as soon as they arrived. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the actions of the subjects featured. By around 980, Eric the Red had begun a movement to colonize Greenland, and it wasn't exactly by choice. Eric was a wild man and had been banished from Iceland for 3 years because he'd eliminated someone. He then named the pretty cold and inhospitable piece of land he found while exploring Greenland to entice people to move there. It worked. A few thousand Vikings ended up settling down and calling Greenland home. Eric then heard of strange lands to the west from a merchant sailor who had been blown off course on his way from Iceland to Greenland. Eric's son, Leif Erikson, was fascinated by the story. So, sometime around 1000 AD, Leif set sail with 35 men to find out if this mysterious land existed. Apparently, it did. Leif and his men set up camp somewhere in what's thought to be Newfoundland. There, his foster father, Tyker, was said to have gotten pretty tipsy on wineberries. It's thought that Tyker's drunkenness could have come about from eating fermented cranberries, gooseberries, or squash berries, all of which grew wild in the region. Leif and his crew didn't stay very long, though. They eventually left and headed back to Greenland. There are no accounts of encounters with Native Americans during Leif's brief visit to the New World. The Viking Greenlanders had probably met some Native Americans in Greenland, however. There's evidence that they traded with the Thule, ancestors of the Inuit. Ivory carvings of Norsemen have been found at Thule archaeological sites, as well as iron and bronze tools that the Thule weren't capable of making themselves. It's thought that the Viking name for Native Americans, Skrælings, probably originated from the Old Norse word skra, which means dried skin, most likely a reference to the animal pelts worn by the Inuit ancestors. In any event, Leif's brother Thorvald ended up making a second voyage west a few years later. Thorvald and his men set up shop for the winter at the camp Leif left behind. In the spring, the Vikings came across 9 natives sleeping under skin-covered canoes and attacked them, eliminating all but one. The one who survived ran to get reinforcements. A battle ensued, and Thorvald lost his life to an arrow. Despite tense relations with the Native Americans, the Vikings ended up staying another winter before heading back to Greenland. A few more years would pass before another Norseman made the journey to the New World. This time it was Thorfinn Karlsefni. Thorfinn was a wealthy merchant with a distinguished lineage. He organized a far larger expedition than either of the Erikson brothers had, with 3 ships, between 160 to 250 men and women, and livestock. Thorfinn's expedition ventured farther south than either Leif or Thorvald's. They ended up settling in a place called Stromfjord. There they encountered more Skrælings. It started off peacefully enough. The two groups bartered with each other, with the Native Americans trading furs for a red cloth and a wondrous liquid called milk that came from the cattle the Vikings had brought over. But then things took a turn. The Viking colonists lived on a knife's edge with the native peoples, and there were increasing instances of hostility and outright fighting. It all came to a head when, according to one account, a bull from the Viking camp got loose and frightened a group of Native Americans. They fled, but came back in greater numbers, ready to fight. They attacked the Vikings with catapults, and a legendary battle ensued. It could have been the last straw for Thorfinn and his prospective colony. They abandoned the site and returned to Greenland. No European would attempt to settle in the New World for hundreds of years. Unfortunately, there isn't much evidence or archaeological finds able to back up the presence of Vikings in the Americas. There are a few, however, such as Lance Meadows in Newfoundland, which might be one of the most intriguing archaeological sites in the world. Back in the 1960s, a Norwegian couple, Helge Ingstad and Anne Stein Ingstad, began scouring the northeastern Canadian coast, hoping to find archaeological evidence for the places mentioned in the sagas. On the northern tip of Newfoundland, they found it. Lance on Meadows has become the only confirmed Viking settlement in North America. The site includes the remains of 8 sod houses, evidence of ironwork that couldn't have been done by Native Americans, and a boat-building frame. Experts think the site could have possibly been a ship repair center, partly because of the physical evidence for boat building, and partly because the settlement sits at a perfect spot for hopping across the North Atlantic to Greenland. A final piece of evidence confirming that Lance on Meadows is indeed a Viking settlement is a small but significant little pin. The bronze pin with a ring at the end was likely used to attach a cloak around the neck, and it is most definitely Viking. There have been others just like it found at various Viking archaeological sites in Scotland and Ireland, and they've all been dated to between 920 and 1050 AD. One of the only other pieces of hard evidence for Viking presence in the Americas was found farther south on a beach in Brooklyn, Maine. One day in August of 1957, an amateur archaeologist named Guy Melgren discovered a curious old coin. At first, he suspected it was a medieval British penny, but then in 1978, experts identified it as a Norse coin that was minted between 1065 and 1093. The site where the coin was found, called the Goddard site, includes a huge number of arrowheads, leading some to speculate that the arrival of the coin coincided with the arrival of archery among the Native Americans in the region. Were they taught by ancient Viking visitors? The Goddard coin was met by a significant amount of skepticism by historians and archaeologists. There had been some fakes in the past regarding the Viking discovery of America, including a hoax map and a fabricated runestone with Norse inscriptions found in Minnesota. However, the Norse coin has been held up to scrutiny by experts, who agree that it is original and that it had all the wear and tear of a coin buried for centuries. We don't know a lot about the Vikings settling in the Americas for periods of time, but we do know of 3 expeditions to the New World because of 2 sagas, the Saga of Eric the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders. Together, they're known as the Vinland Sagas. Both were written down a couple of hundred years after the events that they relate from around the year 1000. They differ in some respects, but tell the same basic stories about Viking settlements in North America. However, there's mystery surrounding where exactly they landed. The sagas mention 3 main places: Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. Helluland was the farthest north and means land of flat stones. In the middle, there was Markland, which means land of forest, and farthest south was Vinland, which means land of wine. There's lots of speculations about where exactly these places are based on how their landscapes are described in the sagas. Some think Helluland could be Baffin Island in the northern Canadian territory of Nunavut. Markland has been hypothesized to be Labrador farther to the southeast, and Vinland is thought to be modern-day Newfoundland. Another mystery surrounds the location of Thorfinn's camp, Stromfjord. In the sagas, Stromfjord is described as having strong currents with high tides, a bay that acted as a natural harbor, craggy rocks in the distance, a winter where the sun rose by mid-morning and set in mid-afternoon, and so many birds nesting that it was hard not to step on eggs. Various places along the northern coast of North America have been proposed for the location of Stromfjord based on these descriptions, from the Bay of Fundy and Lance on Meadows in Canada to Buzzards Bay in Massachusetts, and even as far south as the Long Island Sound in New York. A final piece of the Vikings in America mystery has to do with why they didn't stay. Why couldn't these fierce warriors survive in the Americas for more than a few years? Why didn't they set down roots? Why doesn't a significant portion of the population in North America today speak Norse? Lots of people have speculated about the reasons for this. Maybe they didn't bring enough people and supplies with them on their expeditions. Maybe they were driven out by hostile Native Americans. But one of the leading theories has to do with the weather. During the 11th century, Leif and Thorvald Erikson and Thorfinn Karlsefni led their expeditions to the New World. The climate was warmer. It's known as the medieval warming period, and because of it, there were warmer summers and less Arctic sea ice. But then it got colder. Starting in the 12th century, what's become known as the Little Ice Age caused temperatures to drop and ice to accumulate, making many of the sea routes impassable. It also made life on Greenland and Iceland very difficult for the Vikings. Evidence points to food shortages and plague. Between 1250 and 1700, Iceland's population fell from 150,000 to just 50,000. The Viking stint in North America was brief. What we know about it has been reduced to legend, told through sagas that could be historical fact or mythological fiction, or a combination of the two. The physical evidence includes just one small settlement, a pin, and a coin. Yet it's fascinating to think what could have happened if they stayed. Let us know in the comments what you think. Did the Vikings ever step foot in the Americas? From the end of the 8th through to the 11th century, a mass exodus of Scandinavians leaving their homelands to seek their fortunes elsewhere changed the course of history forever. These strong seafaring warriors, known collectively as Vikings or Norsemen, undertook large-scale raiding, colonizing, conquest, and trading throughout Europe. And although their history was passed down orally and in part observation or inscribed in runes, there is much mystery and speculation about the lives of these fascinating conquerors.
Welcome to Nutty Productions.
We will uncover how the Vikings' commitment to cleanliness, their silken and style tresses, and head-to-toe tattoos shatter the preconceived image we've all been told. Let's get started. Unlike much of the Romanized world, Norse culture did not draw a distinction between male and female beauty. The same terms were used for both men and women, both just as likely to be discussed as the other. Furthermore, the description of a person's beauty did not necessarily have any sensual overtones. For example, a poet could go on at length about how beautiful someone was without anyone assuming that he was attracted to the person being described. That probably would have made dating a little tricky at the time. For women, their physical beauty was based on the whiteness of their arms and the length and shininess of their hair. The longer, the better. If only they left behind their secret to shiny hair in the runes. Compared to the rest of Europe, the Norse cultures put a higher emphasis on cleanliness and hygiene. Many grooming tools, such as metal toothpicks and ear spoons, have been found in archaeological digs. Now, as far as we know, Viking men took serious pride in their appearance, adorning themselves with clothes in bright colors and wearing jewelry and cloak pins that explicitly showed off their wealth. They were also said to bathe at least once a week, which we know doesn't seem like enough these days. But back then, Europeans would bathe 2 to 3 times per year. Sweat baths or steam baths were the Norse versions of saunas and were a popular method for keeping clean. They also used heated stones and hot spring water to create the steam inside their bathhouses. Now, the process of sweating off dirt and grime was viewed as its own form of cleaning. Man, they make it during the heat of a sauna sound like no sweat at all. And their cleanliness didn't stop with their skin. They were even said to change their clothes too much, according to one English cleric. He accused them of doing things specifically to undermine the virtue of married women and even seduce the daughters of nobles to be their mistresses. We don't know about you ladies, but we can appreciate a man that puts a little effort when he's in the middle of conquering a city. With the Vikings being such sticklers for hygiene and having such fluid ideas of beauty, we might expect that makeup would have been a big part of their lifestyle. Surprisingly, this is not actually the case. In the writings of Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, who visited around 965 AD, he mentioned that Viking men and women used some kind of indelible cosmetic to enhance the beauty of their eyes. There is a good chance that if this remark was accurate, that they would have lined their eyes with kohl, a black powder, usually antimony sulfide or lead sulfide used as makeup. Yaqub's note suggested it was conventional for Vikings to add a foreign substance to their face to change or enhance their appearance. In any case, our modern belief that the Vikings painted their faces might not have been entirely accurate, especially considering the lack of proof by way of artistic depictions. Perhaps they were just too busy conquering to find the time. And anyway, with the legion of sports fans who paint their faces and bodies for games today, we've more than made up for lost time. Long hair, short hair, shaved, there were numerous coiffes available to the average Viking man. To keep their locks on lockdown, they had separate brushes for their hair and beards, made of bone, antler, wood, and ivory. They moisturized their beards with shampoo made of special oils of beechwood ash and goat fat. Not exactly appetizing for anyone looking to lean in for a kiss, though, is it? Among the more popular styles that would have been hitting during that time included, but were not limited to, the classic neck-to-shoulder length look. I mean, what better way to display a beautiful head of healthy hair than to let it hang loose, even if it might have gotten in the way when engaging in hand-to-hand combat. It's so annoying when work gets in the way of your look. Not to worry, you could still look trendy without long hair. Well-known wood carvings, Osberg ship, and tapestries. Bayeux tapestry depicts some warriors with short hair on top and the sides, and back of the head either shaved or cut close to the skin, like a little patch of grass on top of the head. Not so practical for keeping your head warm in the winter months. One of our favorite Viking looks was, wait for it, the reverse mullet, aka long hair on top and very short hair in the back. Maybe Flock of Seagulls got their revolutionary hairstyle from Vikings after all. Mystery solved. Taking the reverse mullet one step further was the Viking leader Svenold, who famously had a completely shaved head except for a longish lock of hair on one side of his head. We're sure it was a conversation starter, if nothing else. Men's hairstyles did not start and end with scissors and styling. They were apparently quite particular about hair color as well. Unlike what we've been told, not all Norsemen were born with blonde hair, but that did not stop brunettes and redheads from achieving the golden locks that were a la mode throughout the Viking Age. But it's not likely they could just pop up at a store and pick up some manic panic to do the deed. They would bathe themselves in a very strong soap made with lye, which was able to bleach their hair and beards blonde. Maybe they truly believed that blondes have more fun. Norse women, on the other hand, didn't seem to have as much fun with their hair as their male counterparts. Most women kept their hair long and would style it depending on the demands of their job or status. One hairstyle was to tie their long hair into a single knot at the back of the head, with the free end hanging down like a ponytail. They were also known to adorn their hair with colored ribbons braided into the hair, which indicated a woman was unmarried. While on the other hand, the bun look was often reserved for the ladies who had put a ring on it. While the Vikings might not have participated much in using makeup, it's entirely possible that they chose to indulge in something a little more on the permanent side: tattoos. This makes sense considering these people were courageous warriors who fought without fear of death, yet were also talented craftsmen and artists. They were masters of intimidation, which to an extent involved their appearance. From the dragon heads carved into the bows of their longboats to the markings on their skin, the Vikings projected such an impression of power and brutality that battles were half won at the mere sight of them. And what better way to do that than with a little ink? Arabic scholar Ibn Fadlan noted that the Rusia had tattoos that began at their fingertips and continued up their arms to their necks. And another account describes seeing tattoos on their arms and chest. Well, go big or go home, right? He described the ink as dark green in appearance, but it was likely dark blue, as that was the color that would have been achieved using wood ash, which was the skin coloring agent of those times. Now, what kind of tattoos were these Viking warriors wearing? Well, we're doubting they chose hearts with mom written through the center, but patterns, trees, and animals would have been a pretty solid bet. These markings would have meant a lot to the Vikings, and they likely would have been unrecognizable to others. I wonder if any of those Vikings got a tattoo they regretted. The Vikings' emphasis on being well-groomed reflected the value of the larger culture. It has been suggested that the concept of fate played a part in this, as one never knew the day of one's death and so should always look one's best for the inevitable arrival in the afterlife. So basically, the Vikings invented YOLO. What do you think? Are you going to run out and get the tattoo sleeve you've always dreamed of? Or shave your head and leave a little braid behind to live more like the Vikings? Leave us your take in the comments below. No force made a bigger impact on the history of early Christian Europe than the Vikings. The pagan riders and pirates were the most audacious seafarers of their time, who found Russia, discovered North America, and changed the landscape of Britain and France forever. But to make these omelets, they had to break eggs, and they broke a lot of them. Viking raids were nightmares for Christian Europe, and the tales of their plundering and pillaging became tales of legends.
Welcome to Nutty Productions.
Today, we're going to look back at why Viking raids were so barbaric. During the First Viking Age, the Vikings of Ireland didn't plan to attack North Africa, but circumstances made it happen. Vikings had enjoyed phenomenal success in their first raid on the shores of southern Spain. They had plundered many fortunes, goods, as well as a significant number of prisoners from the ports of Lisbon and Sevilla during the first raid of the Muslim Caliphate of Andalusia. When they arrived the second time in 859 AD, Ibn al-Habib suggested Caliph Abdul al-Rahman intercept them at sea instead of waiting for them to arrive at the shores, as Viking berserkers were unstoppable on land. The strategy worked, and with the help of cannons and archers installed at the port of Lisbon, the Andalusians burned half of 70 advancing Viking ships, forcing the rest of the fleet to retreat. According to Andalusian records, Vikings lost nearly 1,000 men, and about 5,000 to 6,000 of them were captured by the Caliphate. The remaining fleet of Vikings was forced to sail through the Mediterranean Sea, and they ended up spending 8 days in Morocco to regroup. While there, they raided the city of Nacor, took the lives of many, and took many men and women with them, including the daughter of the local emir, and plundered until nothing was left. The Vikings returned to Morocco in the next decade and faced the Berber king of Mauritania. Unfortunately, there are not any reliable sources for what followed and when it happened exactly in the 860s. But it is certain that the Berbers engaged with the Vikings and the battle was quite hairy for both sides, according to the fragmentary annals of Ireland. There were thousands of deaths on both sides, but when the Berber king lost his hand, the battle was paused until the next day. However, unfit to fight anymore, the Berber king fled from the battleground that night, and Vikings took the remaining native soldiers as captives so they could sell them in Ireland. If Ragnar Lodbrok was real, then the siege of Paris was one of his biggest accomplishments. The siege was one of the first two major raids conducted by Vikings against the Kingdom of Francia in the 9th century. The very first attempt of raiding the Frankish kingdom happened in 799 when Charlemagne was still alive and ruling. This raid was the reason behind Charlemagne building a defense system along the northern coast in 810. Even after Charlemagne's death, the defense system was the reason France was able to repulse the Viking invasion at the mouth of the Seine in 820. But in 834, Danes managed to break through it in Frisia and Dorstad. While Seine and Francia were minor skirmishes, Vikings began systematic raiding in the mid-830s, with large raids that took place in Antwerp and Noirmoutier in 836, in Rouen on the Seine in 841, and in Contuvik and Nantes in 842. But Vikings showed what they were capable of in March of 845, when a grand fleet of 120 ships brought more than 5,000 men. Charles the Bald was asked to pay ransom to the Vikings in return for them leaving Paris. The negotiations led to Charles paying a total of 7,000 pounds of silver and gold. That number of precious metals would be anywhere between $2 million to $100 million US in today's worth. Now, we have no idea how much silver and how much gold made up the total of 7,000 pounds, but its worth has to be somewhere in that range today. When the Norsemen arrived at the Seine, Charles the Bald, the then king of Francia, assembled a small army to stop their advance. The Franks divided their army into two parties and positioned themselves on either side of the river. Ragnar got word of the ambush, and the Vikings captured 100 prisoners and offered them to Odin by dangling them in a row along the Seine. This act of brutality instilled a dark fear in Frankish soldiers that helped Norsemen in their campaign. It was Easter Sunday when the horde of Vikings became visible on the horizon from the fortification of Paris. Despite being aware of the arrival of the Norsemen, Paris was severely ill-prepared to deal with the berserkers. Unlike the show Vikings, which shows Ragnar's forces having a hard time in Paris, Ragnar's Vikings were swift as lightning and sacked the city long before Paris's defense forces could understand what just happened. After getting the ransom, the Vikings left Paris promptly, but not for home. Instead of turning around immediately, they took their sweet time and continued raiding other towns, villages, and abbeys on their way back, including the Abbey of St. Bertin. Charles lost the confidence of his subjects for being useless during the defense of Paris and folding so easily to the ridiculous demands of the Norsemen. Also, another thing of significance here, according to the History Channel's Viking show, Ragnar and Rollo were brothers who were part of the same raid on Paris. But in reality, Rollo was nowhere remotely related to Ragnar. He arrived in Paris 40 years later in 885, leading another Viking raid on the City of Love. He too was successful as his predecessor. In fact, some may argue his raid was even more successful. Rollo decided to stay after plundering Paris, and in 911, he was granted significant portions of lands in northern France. Their territory came to be known as Normandy, the land of the Norsemen. While the Danes and Norwegians sailed west, The Swedes were enticed by the high-quality silver coins minted by the Abbasid Caliphate, and they crossed the Baltic Sea to descend across Eastern Europe. Finnish branded these Vikings as Rus, derived from the word ruotsi, which meant a crew of oarsmen. The Rus were the forefathers of modern Russia as they migrated down the Dnieper and Volga rivers. They established settlements along trade routes to the Black and Caspian Seas. They conquered the then Slavic population of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and by the middle of the 9th century, they arrived at Baghdad. Baghdad back then was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and it was perhaps the world's most flourishing city and largest as well. More than 1 million people resided in Baghdad back then, but Rus Vikings found Constantinople a more lucrative project. The reason might have been the economic difference between the two cities. Yes, Baghdad was rich, but Constantinople was harboring treasures beyond imagination. Moreover, the bigger population in Baghdad may have also meant that they had a larger army to defend the city. Constantinople was also a more trade-friendly city that allowed Rus to enjoy its glory and pursue its wealth as merchants. The city still used gold coins, which had become less and less common since the fall of the Roman Empire. But Constantinople was also one of the strongest fortified cities of the 9th century. The shores of the Bosphorus Strait, which enabled the prosperity of Constantinople, were also the gateway for all kinds of invasions. So, Constantinople had itself encircled by a moat and 3 parallel walls. There was also a large iron chain that could be stretched across the mouth of the city's harbor to protect it from a naval invasion. The Rus showed up unexpectedly in June 860. The Byzantine Emperor Michael III was battling the Abbasid Caliphate in Asia Minor, and the Byzantine navy was engaged with the pirates of Arabia on the Mediterranean Sea. Indeed, this was the best time to plunder the wealthiest city in the world, with most of its defenders absent. The Greek patriarch Photius, the Archbishop of Constantinople, described the appearance of Rus ships on the shores of Constantine as a thunderbolt from heaven. Michael III's predecessor, Theophilus, was wary of the Rus from the day they arrived at Constantinople back in 838 as merchants. And even though trade relations were established after the first visit, Theophilus also kept looking over his shoulder for the rest of his reign. Across the Black Sea, 2 Rus leaders, Askold and Dir, had set their bases in Kiev. When the Rus showed up to lay a siege at Constantinople, the queen of the cities was not expecting them to know about the protectors of the city being occupied somewhere else. The city only had its normal garrison to defend the walls under the command of city prefect Nesitas and Orifes. It was one of the most anarchic raids in the history of Viking raids. Photius further described 20,000 Vikings as a swarm of wasps who charged the city walls, but the city of prefect managed to shut the gates on time. While Constantinople was safe under the protection of its thick walls and shackles, the capital's extensive suburbs, the thickly settled shores, and the islands of the Sea of Marmara were now defenseless. Left alone to do whatever they desired outside the city walls, the Rus plundered the suburbs of Constantinople and launched coastal raids around the Sea of Marmara, burning houses, churches, and monasteries, while routing the patriarch's servants. The 9 islands in the Sea of Marmara were devastated. But the Rus had next to no siege skills, and they were against one of the best fortified cities in history. While Rus Vikings waited outside, hoping the city would starve and be forced to open the gates and fight, the highly developed Byzantine military signal system managed to alert the emperor. Michael III rode at breakneck speed to defend his capital city, and his return prompted Askold and Dir to retreat, but they were not going home empty-handed. They returned to Kiev laden with treasure, only to be taken out some years later by Oleg of the Rurikid dynasty, who founded the first Russian state, Kievan Rus. Like Rollo in France, the Rus too turned around, and many of them founded and became part of the Varangian Guards, the personal guards of the Byzantine emperor from the 10th to the 14th century. Vikings had everything in their time that other cultures didn't: ferocity, naval technology, and rich culture. What they didn't have was enough warm land, and they had to cut their own piece from others' cakes, even if the end result was brutal. We hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like and share it.
Medieval Europeans believed in and feared many monsters. Basilisks, demons, dragons, also smart independent women, who they misbranded as witches.
I'm not a witch, I'm not a witch.
But you are dressed as one.
But unlike these made-up monsters, there was one nightmare that was very real and could actually hurt them: a Viking berserker. These raging Norse warriors were known to enter raids and battles with bloodthirsty anger, with madness like a dog, and the strength of a bear or bull. Their crazy tranced eyes, full of lust for blood, were enough to make their enemies lose all hope long before the first strike. However, their penchant for violence, gore, and killing wasn't just something inherent. Their blood dance looked like a trance-like state because they were actually high.
Welcome to Nutty Productions.
And let's talk about what drugs were used recreationally during the Age of Vikings. Vikings would perform blessing rituals before walking into battle or going for a raid. It's believed that during this ritual, berserkers would go into a self-induced hypnotic trance. They would lose conscious control of their actions as their mind would act subconsciously in this dissociative state. People in this state seem remote, have little awareness of their surroundings, and have reduced awareness of pain and increased muscle strength. Despite losing their ability of their critical thinking and having a very little grasp on their social inhibitions, they would still be awake and rage into the battle. Scandinavia is home to many fungal plants, and so the common belief behind the savage bloodthirst of the mighty berserkers was thought to be the consumption of these mushrooms. It started in 1784. A priest named Odin proposed a theory that going berserk was a result of eating fly agaric mushrooms. One of the psychoactive compounds in fly agaric includes muscimol, which is a GABA receptor agonist, causing sedative, hypnotic, depressant, and hallucinogenic effects. Because GABA receptors are everywhere in the brain, muscimol alters neuronal activity in many regions, including the cerebellum, hippocampus, and cerebral cortex, mainly the regions responsible for emotions and higher executive thinking. The effects of muscimol start within 30 to 120 minutes and last for about 5 to 10 hours. Side effects include increased salivation, muscle twitching, tremors, and strong delirium, which all describe berserking. The fly agaric theory is still quite popular and widely accepted among the masses, but most experts find it implausible. Odin based his hypotheses on reports about Siberian shamans, but he never tried the mushroom himself. If he had, he might have changed his mind. In addition to its hallucinogenic effects, eating agaric mushrooms can lead to depression and can make the user apathetic. Fly agaric is also quite poisonous and can cause nausea, vomiting, dizziness, hallucinations, involuntary movements, and seizures. White agaric could not be the cause of berserk fury either, due to the logic that it shares most of the poisonous effects of fly agaric and could put a person in a coma or outright kill a man. Another mushroom that may have been the cause of berserk fury was the fungus Claviceps purpurea, as it contains a compound used to synthesize the hallucinogen LSD or lysergic acid diethylamide. But Claviceps purpurea is also highly poisonous. However, the berserker trance was more like psycho-murder automatism, which in forensic psychiatry can be described as diminished responsibility. The high from that is followed by major emotional catharsis in the form of tiredness, exhaustion, and obviously long hours of sleep. Clearly, such practices of achieving abreaction of strong, aggressive, destructive, and sadistic impulses diminished after the introduction of Christianity, as such rituals and actions were and are considered demonic and thus were discouraged. So, if mushrooms were too stomach-churning for the strongest of Vikings, what was helping them achieve the trance of terror and tyranny? According to the findings of modern scientists, it might have been henbane. Henbane, or stinking nightshade, has propped up in many Norse burial grounds, including the grave of a berserker. Often considered as the crazy plant in much older civilizations, consumption of henbane can cause feelings of delirium, inhibition loss, and manic episodes. It also triggers visual disturbances, hallucinations, drowsiness, and red skin, making it the perfect match for what berserkers experience during their fury. Henbane also acts pretty well as a painkiller, as we mentioned in our video What Drugs Were Like for Ancient Romans and Greeks. Thus, it does fit the bill to help in reducing the sensation of pain among the no-armor-wearing Viking vanguards, who were known for being wild, unpredictable, and highly aggressive. Now comes the question, how do they consume henbane? Karsten Vertoer, an ethnobotanist at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, has very interesting theories about that. Instead of going with the conventional way of smoking it, he believes they might have infused it with alcohol, made an ointment out of it, and rubbed it on their body, or surprisingly, made an herbal tea out of it. We know what you're thinking. Savage berserkers and posh herbal tea do not go well together, especially on the eve of a battle or a raid. But it makes sense because henbane was also found in the grave of a sorceress in Denmark. Nordic sorceresses, or vulva as they were called, were sort of like ancient Greek oracles or sibyls who used hallucinogens to go into a trance-like state to see the future. Vulva worked in a quite similar fashion, but had more shaman-like flair about them. If anybody was making herbal tea out of henbane or stinking nightshade, it would be these ladies. But that doesn't mean henbane was a relatively safer choice than shrooms. Henbane has been used over the centuries as a sedative, a sleeping agent, and to induce hallucinations. The plant is deadly toxic, and even though people did use the plant, it was not at all harmless. So the toxicity had to be reduced because henbane contains hyoscyamine and scopolamine, two substances that have a strong narcotic effect on the nervous system. If the seeds are heated, the two substances evaporate and the vapors may act like a narcotic. This is how the Oracle of Delphi must have used it back in ancient Greece, and perhaps the tea vulva made in Scandinavia was more for inhaling than drinking and must have been served hot right off the pot. So then why is henbane preferred as a more plausible Viking drug over shrooms? Both the plant and the fly agaric mushrooms could have caused many of the symptoms described to berserkers, but according to Karsten Futur, agaric consumption doesn't give you the bloodlust like henbane may have. However, all of this study is still considered quite speculative, and some experts believe that berserkers' trance may have been totally natural and have nothing to do with recreational drugs. But they cannot deny vulva's involvement with henbane and perhaps cannabis as well. In 1903, a farmer stumbled upon an ancient Viking ship in Norway that contained many artifacts from the 800s AD. Among the artifacts were the skeletons of two women and a curious leather bag that contained cannabis seeds. These seeds are thought to be connected to one of those women, known as the Osper Queen. The Osper Queen was suggested to be the Queen Asa of the Yngling clan, mother of Halfdan the Black and grandmother of Harald Fairhair. Many archaeologists believe the woman was not just a secular queen, but also a priestess of Freya, the love goddess of Norse mythology. Archaeologists have believed that the cannabis seeds were used in rituals during this pre-Christian period in Scandinavia. Freya was associated with hemp sowing and harvest festivals across northern Europe, and often erotic rituals were held in her honor. It's thought that the feminine cannabis flower had erotic and love-generating powers, and that those who consumed these flowers would be imbued with the joy and seductive tendencies of the love goddess. Furthermore, Vikings were perhaps the first to take weed across the Big Pond as well. In August 2018, an archaeological team excavated a peat bog located nearly 100 feet east of the Viking settlement at Lons Almedos. They found a layer of ecofacts or environmental remains that may have been brought to the site by humans that were radiocarbon dated to the 12th and 13th century. These ecofacts included the remains of two beetles that were not from Newfoundland. Don't get your hopes up though, they were not John Lennon or Ringo, just some bugs from Greenland. Also, the other remains were pollens of walnuts and cannabis that also don't naturally grow at Lons Almedos. Vikings were regularly in and out of Newfoundland for about 200 years. The evidence of cannabis pollen matching their settlement time does indicate that it must be them who brought the green leaf to the Americas. However, there are still some doubts on this theory, but if not them, then who else? And that leaves us with opium. It is true that Vikings were aware of poppy and cultivated it in their Danish Viking Age kitchen garden. But was it used recreationally? Unfortunately, neither the Viking sagas nor archaeological excavations have given us an answer to that. But what do you think? Tell us in the comments about what other ages or civilizations should we cover in this series. And as always, thanks for watching Nutty History.
Sold into peasantry, a young Viking outcast would rise to become king. Olaf Tryggvason's story is one of the least likely of all the Viking sagas. He spent his youth on the run, avenged the death of his father, became a renowned warrior, and received a vision from a prophet. He fell in love and then lost it. He converted to Christianity, became king of Norway, and then went on one of the most bloodthirsty sprees in history, trying to make sure everyone else believed in the same God he did. and then he threw himself off his ship in full armor and sank to the bottom of the sea. Or maybe he didn't. This is a story of Olaf Tryggvason, the wicked Christian Viking that history nearly forgot. On the lam.
Olaf Tryggvason was born into chaos sometime around 960 AD. When he was just a couple years old, his father Tryggva Olafsson was killed by Harald Greatcloak, a rival nobleman who saw Tryggva as a threat. Now, Greatcloak and his brother seized power from the Norwegian king Håkon the Good, and they were on a mission to find Olaf and eliminate him. He had a possible claim to the throne through blood relation to Harald Fairhair, another legendary Viking and the first king of Norway.
In the wake of his father's death, Olaf and his mother Astrid were forced to flee Norway. They found refuge in Sweden for a while. Eventually, though, Harald Greatcloak found out where they were. He sent emissaries to the king of Sweden to request that the mother and son be returned to Norway, where they would be, let's say, better taken care of. They made it seem like a kind of noble rescue mission, but in reality, both Olaf and Astrid would probably meet a gruesome end. The Swedish king eventually took Greatcloak's side and sent some men to go find the mother and son. It was not a peaceful search party, but Astrid was a Viking. That means she could fight. When the men found them, it said that she fought off the men and escaped with young Olaf. You could imagine her fighting, baby Olaf in one arm and an axe in another.
Whatever way it happened, it worked. Astrid and Olaf went on the run again. This time Astrid had Kievan Rus in mind. Kievan Rus was a powerful and culturally diverse medieval Eastern European state ruled by Vladimir the Great. Astrid's brother served in Vladimir's court there, and they could get refuge there. So they hopped on a ship to Novgorod. The ship would never reach its destination. Things were about to get even worse for the young Viking and his mother.
From slave to warrior. On its way to Kievan Rus, Olaf's ship was hijacked in the Baltic Sea by Estonian Vikings. Olaf was captured and sold at the age of 3. We don't know what happened to his mother, but for the next few years, Olaf lived in Estonia and was the property of a man named Klirken. At some point, while he was the property of Klirken, Olaf was adopted by a guy named Thorhald. He then sold young Olaf to someone else in exchange for a ram. No, not the truck. The man then sold him to a guy named Rhys for a nice cloak.
6 years later, a Viking warrior named Sigurd Erikson was traveling through Estonia on a mission to collect taxes for King Vladimir, and he saw a young boy who clearly was not a native of the region. He started talking to the boy and asked about his family. Young Olaf responded that he was, Olaf, the son of Tryggva Olafsson and Astrid Eriksdottir. Sigurd Erikson realized that noble blood ran in his kid's veins and went to Olaf's owner, Rhys, and negotiated for his release, and then brought him back to Novgorod to live in Vladimir the Great's court.
Sometime later, in the bustling Novgorod marketplace, Olaf had a run-in with his former owner, Klirken. Let's just say that Olaf wasn't pleased to see him. As soon as he realized that it was, in fact, his former owner, he bashed him in the head with an axe, settling the Viking blood debt that had haunted him for years. But here's the deal. Olaf's violent act did not go unnoticed. An angry mob quickly formed after people in the busy market saw what happened. Klirken was apparently a pretty important guy, and they didn't like what had just happened. They chased Olaf through the streets of Novgorod, hoping to bring justice to this kid who in their eyes just committed a random killing. Olaf was able to escape though, and made it safely to the court of Queen Algia, Vladimir's wife. In order to appease the mob, she gave them so-called blood money to compensate for Klirken's death, and everything ended up working out. For a while at least. As Olaf grew older and more experienced, his skills and leadership abilities became apparent. Vladimir the Great saw how talented Olaf was with an axe and appointed him chief of his men-at-arms. Olaf served Vladimir faithfully for a couple of years, earning the respect of the soldiers under his command.
But Olaf's popularity and influence continued to grow, and Vladimir didn't like it. He started to fear that Olaf might pose a threat to his own reign, and Vladimir slowly distanced himself from the man he once considered a close ally.
Olaf realized that his days in Novgorod were numbered and set out for the Baltic to seek his fortune elsewhere. Love, loss, and prophecy.
For the next few years, Olaf raided towns and cities along the coast of the Baltic Sea with pretty good success. He amassed a sizable navy and was doing quite well for himself. In 982, his fleet was caught in a storm and was forced to make port in Vinland on the Baltic coast in modern-day northeast Germany. Olaf walked into the court of the queen there and immediately
fell in love. It is said that Queen Gita held a banquet for Olaf and his men. During the banquet, Olaf and Gita talked, and then did some other things. They fell head over heels for each other. Olaf ended up staying in Vinland indefinitely. They got married. As a wedding gift, Olaf asked her if there were any towns that she lost control of. After she listed off a few, Olaf went out and resubjugated them in her name. If that's not Viking love, I don't know what is. Olaf's marriage to Gita brought him into an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor Otto II. It's around this time that the Viking warrior probably got his first taste of Christianity. Otto II was amassing an army to fight against a coalition of Danish and Norwegian Vikings led by Danish King Harald Bluetooth and Norwegian King Håkon Jarl. Olaf helped Otto defeat the Viking kings in a couple of battles, converting Harald Bluetooth and many of his men to Christianity along the way. Håkon Jarl wasn't so keen on accepting Jesus, though, and returned to Norway still pagan. Remember that because it'll be important later. After 3 butterfly-in-the-stomach-filled years with Gita, tragedy struck. Gita died, and Olaf was heartbroken. He couldn't bear to stay in Vinland anymore and decided to do what any respectable Viking would do, take out his grief by going on a raiding spree. But Olaf eventually realized that all the raiding in the world couldn't fill the hole in his heart. He needed some spiritual guidance. He heard that there was a hermit/seer living on an island. Now, the records aren't clear, but some historians think it might have been St. Leif, who was living somewhere on the Isle of Scilly off the coast of Cornwall, England. Olaf was still skeptical of this Christian life, though, so he decided to send one of his men posing as himself to try and trick the prophet. The prophet wasn't tricked. Olaf decided he must be the real deal and went to see him. During their meeting, the prophet hermit told him that, wait a minute, let me get my best prophetic voice together over here. Thou wilt become a renowned king and do celebrated deeds. Many men wilt thou bring to faith and baptism, and both to thy own and others' good. Thank you very much. Right after the meeting, some of Olaf's men mutinied. Olaf was wounded but survived, and it's said that afterwards he immediately converted to Christianity. Becoming king. Olaf eventually made his way to Ireland, where he met another queen with a pretty similar name to his late wife's. Queen Gita, with a Y instead of an EI, had just lost her husband and was in the market for a new one. Suitors were coming from far and wide dressed to the Viking nines, but when Gita saw Olaf wearing what the sagas describe as his bad weather clothes, she was convinced that he was the one for her. So Olaf and Gita got hitched, but word soon started to spread around the Viking world that there was an Irish king who had noble Norwegian blood. Up in Norway, Håkon Jarl, the Norwegian king who refused to convert to Christianity after losing a few battles to Otto II, decided to investigate. He sent a guy named Ture Klaka, hope I said that right, over to Ireland posing as a merchant to try and trick Olaf into coming back to Norway so Håkon could eliminate him. Instead, Klaka turned on Håkon. He told Olaf that Håkon had ticked off a lot of the Norwegian jarls by taking too many women as concubines. People weren't happy, and Olaf saw an opportunity to go into Norway and fulfill the prophecy spoken to him by the hermit on the Isle of Scilly. Olaf stormed into Norway with a vengeance. Håkon didn't stand a chance. The story goes that the soon-to-be former king of Norway ended up hiding from Olaf in a pigsty with one of his loyal servants. He thought he was loyal anyway. While Håkon slept in the pigsty one night, the servant changed his loyalties and decapitated his master. He then brought Håkon's severed head over to Olaf as proof of his newfound loyalty. Olaf wasn't impressed by it, though, and his reaction to the servant's grisly act was equally ruthless. Instead of thanking him, he removed his head as well. It was the year 995. Olaf was now king of Norway, and it was time to start converting everyone to Christianity. The Christian King. Olaf wanted a united Christian Scandinavia, and he went about trying to make that happen using some pretty heavy-handed means. Things started off innocently enough. Olaf himself baptized the famed Viking explorer Leif Erikson, who then brought a priest with him on his return to Greenland to convert everyone over there. But anyone who refused Jesus and Olaf's presence was not long for this world, and if they did survive, it was with some serious injuries. Now, one guy who would not convert was Rod the Strong, a powerful chieftain who was quite adamant about maintaining his beliefs in the traditional Norse gods. To try and persuade him, Olaf stuffed a drinking horn into Rod's mouth and, using a red-hot iron, persuaded a venomous snake to slide down his throat and into his stomach. Rod did survive. I mean, would you? Olaf then took all of Rod's gold and other valuables, Rod's flagship longboat, and any of his people who didn't convert to Christianity joined Rod in Valhalla, or hell as far as Olaf was concerned. Downfall. Olaf's crusade started rubbing many of his fellow Vikings the wrong way. By the year 1000, a coalition of Swedes, Danes, and the Norwegian Earls of Lade got together and decided to put an end to Olaf's attempted Christianization campaign. The Christian Viking king of Norway met his end at the Battle of Svolder in the western Baltic Sea. Outmanned and outshipped, I guess you could say he was outshipped. Can you be outshipped? Anyway, Olaf and his massive flagship longboat, nicknamed the Long Serpent, were surrounded. Now, instead of being captured, Olaf looked around and maybe prayed to Jesus, and then jumped into the water in full armor, taking his own life. It was a very un-Viking thing to do. Death in battle and receiving your reward in Valhalla was one of the Vikings' main goals in life. But Olaf didn't believe any of that. Though some say Olaf managed to swim to safety, helped by angels as one legend has it. If he did survive, though, it was probably thanks to a Vended ship that came to his rescue. Rumors still swirl that the Christian Viking king survived, became a monk, and journeyed to the Holy Land of Jerusalem. Either that, or his body washed ashore in some remote part of Scandinavia. I mean, it could have gone either way. What do you think?
Berserkers, axe-wielding, shield-splitting warriors, rampaging through towns and cities throughout Northern Europe, conquering and pillaging and being good sailors and boat builders. For 300 years, the Vikings were a force to be reckoned with. So, here are some of the most feared Viking warriors in history. Cnut the Great.
The most prolific Viking warrior and conqueror of all time was likely Cnut the Great. I mean, at the height of his powers, he was the king of 3 countries. Actually, like 3 and a half. His official title was King of England, King of Norway, King of Denmark, and King of part of Sweden. He was able to unite swaths of Scandinavia and Northern Europe into what's been called the North Sea Empire, and he used a terrifying combination of brains and brawn to do it.
Cnut stormed into England in 1015 with an army of 10,000 men and 200 ships. It was a coalition of Viking mercenaries from all over Scandinavia. Cnut had experience fighting in England already. He joined his father, Sweyn Forkbeard, as he conquered the Isle a few years earlier, becoming the first Viking king of England. But Forkbeard died suddenly soon after, and English King Ethelred forced Cnut and his men back to Denmark. Cnut wasn't happy. I mean, would you be? And he let Ethelred know it by stopping in the coastal town of Sandwich on their way back up to Denmark and removing the heads, ears, and noses of quite a few hostages they'd taken with them, which they left on the beach to let the English know they'd be back. And Cnut came back with a vengeance. Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside, was the one leading the English resistance against the Vikings, and it didn't go well for the Englishmen. In just a few months, the Vikings had besieged London. A deathly ill Ethelred was trapped inside, and he'd pass away during the siege. The Vikings built dikes and dug canals all around London, which allowed their longboats to patrol the perimeter of the city and block the flow of supplies and information along the River Thames, London's lifeline for trade and communication. By controlling the river, the Vikings were able to restrict the movement of ships carrying provisions to and from London. Edmund Ironside and the rest of the Londoners were starving with nowhere to go. It's said that during the final battle, the Bishop of Dorchester was saying Mass in front of Edmund's men when the Vikings stormed through, chopping his body to pieces. This bloody symbol of war would be Cnut's welcome to the throne of England. He signed a treaty with Edmund. Cnut would control all of Europe except Wessex, which Edmund would control. Upon the death of either Edmund or Cnut, the other would become king of all of England. Edmund was wounded during one of the last battles, though, and would die just a few weeks later. Cnut was the king of England.
More wrath was to follow. Cnut went about purging his new kingdom, eliminating any threat to his throne. He took out a slew of English noblemen, including Ethelred's other son, Edwig. The rest of Ethelred's family fled to Normandy, where the late king's wife Emma had protection. But the funny thing is that Cnut would end up marrying Emma of Normandy, and despite his brutal past, he actually ended up being a pretty good king.
He was religiously tolerant and struck a good balance between English culture and Viking culture. He supposedly converted to Christianity and even got to meet the Pope.
Eric Bloodaxe. A guy with a nickname Bloodaxe is most likely someone you don't want to mess with. And Eric Bloodaxe was most definitely a scary Viking. He served a stint as the King of Norway, then ended up in England as the King of Northumbria between 947 and 954. Oh, yeah, and he probably killed 4 of his brothers.
According to the Norse saga Fagiskina, Eric's father, who was the King of Norway, Harold Fairhair, gave his son 5 ships when Eric was just 12. He proceeded to terrorize the Danish coast for a few years before moving south along the Scottish coast and the Irish Sea for a few more years. His axe? Well, it got quite bloody from all the raiding. That's how he got his surname. But there's another story about how Erik got his nickname, and it's even more gruesome, at least according to the Egil Saga. Erik's dad, Harald, had a lot of sons. He'd united the Kingdom of Norway and given kingships to 5 or 6 of them, Erik included. But when Harald died, things turned bad very quickly. In a bid to take all of Norway for himself, Erik murdered 4 of his brothers, rampaged through Norway, and took their lands by force. He nearly succeeded, but he missed a half-brother named Håkon. The remaining Norwegian lords were so unhappy with the ruthlessness of Erik's reign that they teamed up, defeated Erik, and installed Håkon as king. Erik, with the blood of 4 brothers on his axe, fled to England, where he would cozy up with King Ethelred and become the ruler of Northumbria. Egil Skallagrimsson. Egil Skallagrimsson allegedly wrote his first poem when he was 3 and took his first life when he was 7. He was a bloodthirsty berserker and an accomplished poet. Imagine that. He also dabbled in a bit of sorcery. And as far as Vikings go, Egil was basically a polymath. He challenged a bunch of people to Viking duels called holmgangs in the following years, and in one particular face-off, he finished his opponent by nearly biting off his head. Egil had a fierce rivalry going with Harald Fairhair, the king of Norway, and when the aforementioned Erik Bloodaxe came to power, things got really bloody. According to the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, things started to escalate when he took out one of the king's close friends, a guy named Bror of Atli, who had apparently insulted Egil somehow, but based on what we know about Egil's short temper, Bror probably just told him that his shoe was untied or something. King Bloodaxe and his wife, Queen Gunhilla, weren't very happy about this, so Gunhilla sought vengeance for the death of Bror. Gunhilla, known for her cunning and desire for revenge, ordered her 2 brothers, Eyvind the Braggart and Alfred Axman, to assassinate Egil and his brother. It didn't work out so well for the brothers. They couldn't take Egil by surprise, and he was able to fight back in typical berserker style and end both their lives with his axe. With the poet/berserker apparently impervious to death, Erik and Gunhilla declared Egil an outlaw. It was open season on his head. He was no longer under protection of the law and could be pursued and captured by anyone. In response to the outlaw status, a guy named Berg Annander, a follower of Erik Bloodaxe, assembled a group of men to capture Egil. But once again, their attempt to apprehend him ended in failure, and Egil managed to turn the tables and killed Berg Annander. Before escaping from Norway, Egil had one last middle finger for Erik and Gunhilla. He took the life of one of their sons, Rongunvolder, as revenge for all their attempts on his life before sailing off to England, where he would play the berserker in several important battles. He cursed the royal couple. He took a horse's head, which was a powerful symbol of shame and disgrace, and stuck it on something called a knitting pole. According to his saga, Egil set up the pole in the cliff face and left it standing. He faced the horse's eyes on the land and carved runes upon the pole, and said all the formal words of the curse. Bjorn Ironside. If you're wondering why the famous Ragnar Lothbrok of the Viking series hasn't been mentioned yet, well, you know what? There's a good reason. He may not have ever existed. There's very little evidence that he was anything more than a legend. There is one mention of him in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle around 840 AD, where 2 Viking raiders named Ragnar and Reginhirus pop up. A lot of historians think that these 2 were kind of combined into the actual historical Ragnar Lothbrok, but there's still a lot of debate on that. We do know that a few of his sons who historically claimed to be the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, did exist. Again, it's unclear if these sons were actually his sons, or if they were just associating their names with a legend to gain status. You know, clout chasing. But let's talk about one of the greatest, Bjorn Ironside. Bjorn appears in a few different chronicles, and he was perhaps one of the most well-traveled Vikings in history. According to Frankish sources, the Swedish warrior terrorized France for a few years in the mid-800s, sailing down the Seine, looting Paris twice, and setting up a semi-permanent camp nearby. He then set his sights on the Mediterranean. According to legend, Bjorn led a fleet of Viking longships on daring voyages to raid and plunder cities along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, including the Iberian Peninsula, North Africa, and Italy. He co-piloted the journey along with his foster father, a Viking named Haston. One of the most interesting parts of their trip was a bit like the Viking version of the Trojan horse, if the gods on the horse made a mistake and ended up at the gates of the wrong city. The Vikings arrived at a town called Luni, which they thought was Rome because, well, they were Vikings
from Scandinavia, and their map game was suspect. They tried their best to breach the town's walls, but were having a pretty tough time. So to gain entry, Hastin and Bjorn channeled their inner Greek and came up with a pretty clever plan.
Hastin feigned a near-death illness and asked that he be given access to the local church for Christian sacraments and burial on consecrated ground. The unsuspected clerics led Hastin and a small honor guard into the chapel, but to their surprise, Hastin leaped from his stretcher and he, Bjorn, and their men proceeded to chop their way through the horrified Italians and open up the gates. But once they were inside Luni, the Vikings realized that it wasn't Rome as they had initially believed. They realized that the real Rome would be a whole lot harder to get into than his comparatively insignificant city. So they changed their minds about the whole Rome thing and set sail back toward Scandinavia.
Thorhall the Tall.
The Jomsvikings were a group of elite mercenaries who lived during the 10th and 11th centuries. They were the best of the best. They observed a strict code of conduct and were near fanatical followers of the Old Norse gods at a time when Christianity was seeping into Viking culture from all sides. They lived in a mysterious fort called Jomsburg that no one has been able to find, but historians actually think was real. They trained there like Navy SEALs. I mean, who knows, maybe David Goggins knows about this place.
One of the most fearsome of these already most fearsome Jom kings was Thorhall the Tall. Thorhall was a powerful Danish nobleman and a warrior who was a big player in the Viking conquest of England in the early 11th century. He was known for his towering height, obviously, unless he was super short and his friends had a sense of humor. But no, he was a tall, powerful, well-trained fighting machine of a Viking.
Thorhall the Tall initially served as a prominent member of the Jomsvikings, where he made a name for himself in the Battle of Jorungavirga. Did I say that right? Man, I sure hope so. Anyway, the battle was a crazy one between the Danish mercenaries of the Jarls of Larda, a group of Norwegian Jarls. It was a naval battle, but one that took place in an intense hailstorm. As if arrows and axes weren't enough to worry about, the warriors apparently had to avoid getting knocked out by a piece of ice the size of a golf ball.
In the early 11th century, Thorhall the Tall entered into a complex web of alliances and conflicts involving quite a few Scandinavian rulers. He ended up fighting alongside King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark in military campaigns. Thorhall's military prowess and strategic abilities proved instrumental in helping Sweyn plow through England in around 1011 and helped capture London in 1013. But then Sweyn died, and his son Cnut, the one we discussed earlier, came to power. Thorhall's loyalty wasn't exactly unwavering. He later switched sides and allied with the English king Ethelred the Unready against the Danish forces led by Cnut. Thorhall played a crucial role in leading the English armies against the Danes, and his defection significantly weakened Cnut's position in England. But not that much. Cnut came through victorious, and after Ethelred died of an illness during Cnut's siege of London, Thorhall switched back, and he was such a great warrior that Cnut apparently brushed off the fact that he'd betrayed him and served as the King of England, Norway, Denmark, as one of his most important and powerful military commanders. For 300 years, the Vikings ran rampant across northern Europe. They raided, they sailed through unknown waters, they clobbered people with axes. Their mythology has become one of the most storied in history, despite the fact that they never actually wrote anything down until much later. They've become a household name and inspired countless documentaries and movies. They've become a symbol of both brutality and ingenuity, a people that navigated seas, created complex trade networks, and ended the lives of women and children, and enslaved them. Let's take the good with the bad and check out the filthy secrets of the Vikings.
Human sacrifice.
Ah, the good old days, when a person could be sent to the afterlife in the hopes that their sacrifice would bring a good harvest, or success in battle, or make sure the sun rose the next day, or whatever else that culture thought was important at the time. Lots of cultures practiced human sacrifice: the Egyptians, the ancient Chinese, the Aztecs, the Inca, and of course, the Vikings.
But just like your flaky friend on a Friday night, accounts of the scope and scale of Viking human sacrifices was pretty unreliable. A few of the accounts we have of it come from Christian monks, who thought the pagan Vikings were savages, and were probably not too thrilled about all the raiding and pillaging they were doing in Europe. One description comes from a German bishop named Thietmar of Merseburg, an objectively excellent name and the next main character of whatever Game of Thrones spinoff is coming down the pipeline. Thietmar of Merseburg wrote a long chronicle of German history, and in part of it he described how the Vikings would meet up every 9 years in a place called Lierde in modern-day Denmark. There, they would sacrifice 99 people to the gods, as well as 99 horses, dogs, and other animals in order to ask the gods for forgiveness of their sins. They really loved the number 9. Another German monk, Adam of Bremen, wrote a similar thing, this time about an event at a temple in Uppsala, Sweden, where the Vikings again met every 9 years to sacrifice to the gods. Adam's account at least is a little less murdery. Only 9 people and 9 horses, dogs, etc. were sent to the Norse afterlife every 9 years at Uppsala, according to his writings. One of the most trustworthy accounts may come from Ibn Khaldun, an Arab traveler and author who traversed numerous Viking communities in the 10th century and is said to have seen a lot of gruesome things. In one passage, he describes the death of a young girl who was ritually sacrificed when an old woman known as the Angel of Death entered a pavilion and looped a cord around her neck and gave the crossed ends to 2 men for them to pull. Then she approached her with a broad-bladed dagger, which she plunged between her ribs repeatedly, and the men strangled her with the cord. Doesn't seem like a nice way to go, but for the Vikings, the gods needed to be appeased. Magic mushrooms. Psychedelic mushroom therapy is picking up steam in the U.S. The fungus is already decriminalized in Colorado and Oregon, and more states look poised to do the same. But while today magic mushrooms are used for therapy and for just making it seem like trees are talking to you, let me tell you, they had a much different role in Viking society. The legendary Viking warriors known as berserkers were known to rile themselves into trance-like state before battles. Accounts of the berserkers come from a few sources. One is a 9th century poem honoring the Viking king Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway who reigned from 872 to 930. Another was written in the 13th century by Snorri Sturluson, an Icelandic poet and historian responsible for writing and compiling the Prose of Edda, the most frequently cited source of Norse mythology. Both accounts describe warriors who were mad as dogs and strong as bears who killed people with a single blow. They would bite their shields and eat embers from fires. Enemies' blades would bounce off their skin. A terrifying sight for sure. Now, I don't know what I'd do if I was on the opposing side of these guys. Other than wet my pants. The berserkers started out with symptoms resembling body chills and shaking. Then, their faces would turn red and they'd be sent into an uncontrollable rage, followed by a withdrawal-like come-down where they'd be fatigued and emotionally numb. There's been some uncertainty about what exactly the Vikings were eating that would send them into their war frenzy. For a while, scientists and archaeologists thought it might be Amanita muscaria, a red and white spotted mushroom that has curiously become a popular fixture in Christmas scenes with elves and Christmas trees. The mushroom is known to cause pretty violent fits of hallucinations, drunkenness, and drooling. It's not your average psilocybin shroom, not as hallucinogenic, but still pretty intense. Well, maybe not Last of Us intense, but you get the idea. However, another theory suggests that the Vikings got high on henbane, a common herb used since the ancient Greeks as a narcotic, painkiller, and anesthetic. According to Slovenian ethnobotanist Karsten Futur, the symptoms experienced by the Viking berserkers more closely resemble the effects of henbane. This seems to be backed up by discoveries of the herb in various Viking grave sites in Denmark, Britain, and Ireland. The hallucinating berserker theory is just a theory, though. The Viking warriors could have just as easily been all hopped up on alcohol, or the effects could have been brought about by fits of epilepsy or mental illness. We may never know. Iceland's trapped women. Other women had a similarly horrible time during the Viking Age. In fact, most of the women who ended up in Iceland were probably what can sensitively be phrased as fornication servants. An analysis of DNA from the residents of Iceland has revealed that around 80% of the men who originally populated the island were Scandinavian Norse. Makes sense, but for the women, it was a different story. More than 50% of the original women settlers were apparently Celtic, which means that they were from Scotland, Ireland, and England. These were places that the Vikings had been terrorizing for years, raiding and, stealing people. The majority of the women who ended up populating Iceland then were most likely enslaved, known as thralls to the Norse. Thralls were a key part of Viking society. They did all the grunt work in the villages if they were men, and taken advantage of if they were women. Violent mythology. When it comes to the Vikings, the line between fact and fiction is very blurry.
A lot of what we know about Viking history is revisionist because they didn't write much down. So the things we know about their culture and their leaders comes from a few Scandinavian poets and writers who put pen to paper a couple of centuries after the Viking Golden Age. So with that in mind, let's check out some wild Norse mythology that's just downright sinister.
Let's start with the Norse belief in how the world was created. In the beginning, the universe was just a big empty void, but then capitalism popped into existence and filled that void with all kinds of nice products like iPhones and skateboards and designer purses, so we wouldn't feel so empty. Sorry, got a little ahead of myself. According to the Vikings, the empty universe was eventually split by ice and fire, and then filled up by a hermaphroditic god named Ymir. Ymir became the mother or father of a race of giants, and a cow who licked stones to make some other gods. These other gods, who included Odin, didn't much like Ymir, so they decided to take his/her life and create the earth from his or her remains. Ymir's body became the earth. Ymir's skull became the sky. The god's blood became the rivers and seas, and Ymir's brains became the clouds. With such a violent creation story, it's no wonder the Vikings were so belligerent. Then there's the unfortunate story of Loki, the Norse god of mischief. At some point, Loki's mischief got the best of him, and he accidentally took the life of one of Odin's sons. In retaliation, and there's always retaliation, the gods took Loki's two sons, turned one into a wolf, and the wolf god tore apart his brother. The gods then took the entrails of Loki's deceased son and tied him up in a cave where he is still trapped to this day. Imagine being a cave explorer and seeing that.
Thanks to their resurgence in pop culture with movies, TV shows, and video games, everybody wants to be as cool as Vikings. But it is important to mention that such a fantasy is based on a highly watered-down version of kings that the media created. The Vikings had participated in weird traditions that most people nowadays would consider barbaric. Life was a lot more disturbing than just looting and pillaging Britain's shores now and then.
Welcome to Nutty Productions.
And today, let's find out weird things that were considered normal in the age of the Vikings. The reason Vikings were so good at overwhelming their enemies during an invasion was how they would bash into the enemy lines like wrecking balls. This reckless method of attack is why the word berserker is now closely associated with Vikings. If you saw a Viking berserker charging at you, you will definitely soil your pants because of how inhuman and terrifying they looked at that moment. The secret behind their appearance of being in such a rage-filled trance was in fact that they were literally in a daze because of shrooms. Yep. Good old magic mushrooms. It was common among Vikings to eat psilocybin mushrooms to make them numb towards pain and violence. Sweden, Denmark, and Norway are native to these hallucinogenic mushrooms, and they seeped into Viking religious rituals which later became battle customs. Now we let you decide what's more wacky to do while being high, slaughtering people and risking your life to plunder slaves, or watching The Wizard of Oz while listening to Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. Late medieval and early modern history is filled with tales of duels on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Thanks to a certain musical, the duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr is quite a trending topic in history these days. And let's not forget the legendary duel scenes from the Kubrick classic, Barry Lyndon. Very few people know how dueling became a thing. Well, like a lot of other things related to early modern Europe, dueling was also a gift of the Viking invaders. Back in the Viking Age, they were known as holmgang. Duels were an integral part of a weird justice system of Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians. You could get away with cutting someone's throat, but not cutting someone's pocket. Many situations of dispute and crime were resolved by the accuser challenging the accused to a battle. In many circumstances, this was a battle to the death. Accepting the duel was a matter of honor. Refusing would mean confessing to the crime that one had been accused of. Same goes for if one fails to show up at the time of the duel. But this barbaric custom had its set of rules and regulations which were decided by the challenger. So, not that ironclad, right? The word Viking is a bit of a catch-all term for groups of seafaring people in the 8th to 11th centuries who came from modern-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. These guys were traders and explorers, but more famously, raiders and pirates. They didn't actually wear horned hats and, quite frankly, resented the stereotype. One of the most famous Vikings was the awesomely named Eric the Red. Eric founded a Viking settlement on an island northwest of Iceland, and in what might be history's first advertising scam, he named this frigid, icy country Greenland.
to entice people to move there. Well, now that Eric the Red and the other Vikings had their cozy little colony set up in Greenland, they needed to start making bank. Perhaps it was Eric's skills in false advertising, but they soon began trading certain valuable exports with other regions. The Vikings had a good deal going with these southern European nations, and one of the most demanded products were rare, expensive, and magical unicorn horns. Now, we all know what a unicorn is, right? Big fancy horse, one long horn, not actually real.
I'm pretty sure none of that's real.
You're not real, man.
A passion for bronies and a beverage source for Lord Voldemort. The fantastical creature has captured the imagination for thousands of years. It is mentioned in ancient Greek histories, Indian and Chinese mythology, and the Bible. Unicorns go way back. According to ancient legend, unicorns were wild, vicious animals, a far cry from the sparkly cartoon creatures we think of today. Unicorns could never be captured alive because if you cornered one, it would throw itself over a cliff, horn first, and the beast's magical horn would absorb all of the force of the fall. I'm guessing unicorns have horns made of vibranium. But most importantly, for the Vikings, unicorn horns were said to have magical healing powers. The horn of a unicorn was supposed to be able to detect and even neutralize poison. It was said that if you touched a unicorn horn to a plate of food and the food started to smoke, the dish was poisoned. Unicorn horns were also soaked in water to create an infusion to cure leprosy, or ground into powder to treat snake bites or the plague. King James I of England once realized he'd been sold some bad horn when he poisoned one of his own servants to test its anti-poison powers. Dude, always get a receipt. Despite this, European royalty as a whole could not get enough of these unicorn horns, giving them lavish gifts and making them into scepters, sword hilts, and crowns. The throne that is used to this day by the King of Denmark was said to be made of unicorn horns. Okay, that sounds so much cooler than the Iron Throne. Because of these royal bronies and medical quackery, the demand for unicorn horns only grew over the centuries. By the Renaissance, a horn was worth 10 times its weight in gold. Obviously, what Vikings were selling were not the horns of some magical horses. Perhaps Vikings may have mistaken them for magical horns when they first discovered them washing up on their shores of Greenland. But the Vikings should have realized pretty quickly that these were not actually from horses. They weren't even horns. What the Vikings were pawning off as horns were the tusks of narwhals, a kind of whale. The word narwhal is Old Norse and means corpse whale. The Vikings thought the animal's gray, mottled skin looked like a dead body, and as usual, they believed in giving things the most death metal sounding names possible. Male narwhals have one long, specialized canine tooth that pokes right through the upper lip in a fashionable natural lip piercing, and conveniently looks exactly like the spiral horn of the legendary unicorn. The exact purpose behind this crazy tooth is a bit of a mystery. Since only males usually have tusks, it's probably a mating display, like the antlers of a deer. But the tusks are also loaded with sensory nerves, meaning that they can be used to sense the environment around them. Who knows, maybe the narwhals use them to detect poison. Vikings sold these narwhal tusks as unicorn horns to anybody who would buy them. If someone discovered that these actually came from a whale, they had a perfectly responsible response. The horns were not from a whale, but a sea unicorn. Duh! This is actually not as lame of an excuse as it sounds. In ancient times, people believed that every creature on land had a counterpart beneath the sea. Hey, we got sea lions, right? Sea horses? And everybody knows about mermaids. Alas, as always, science marches on. In 1638, a zoologist named Old Worm set out to find the truth. Old Worm, whose name has like equal but opposite energy to Eric the Red, cataloged our narwhal skull and stated definitely it was a type of whale. Still, he was willing to consider that despite the horn's non-unicorn status, the legend of its powers might hold true. Old Worm was a dedicated scientist, so he ground up some narwhal horn, then promptly poisoned his pets. Though slightly nicer than King James, this was still pretty rude. The narwhal horn didn't cure the animals, putting an end to the scam once and for all. Just kidding. People continued to sell narwhal tusk as unicorn horns for another 100 years or so. The fraudsters even branched out and sold ground-up deer antlers and cow horns as phony corn horn. Still, as time went on and these scientific methods spread, chemistry finally began to replace magic as the go-to for medical science. Nowadays, we have rigorous methods to verify the effectiveness of what we put into our bodies. The Vikings would have a hard time pulling off such a con today. In games and movies, Viking longhouses look pretty cool, right? Cozy interior, warm hearth fire, fur-based rugs and sheets, and quite a naval-style fabulous architecture. But what we don't get to see in the movies is what an utter pile of health hazards these longhouses were. These cool-looking Viking longhouses were constructed in a way that encouraged the collection of fine particles of nitrogen dioxide and carbon monoxide. You know, the stuff we make special detectors to warn us about so we don't die snoring. Even though Vikings had holes in the roof to let the smoke out, the architecture of the house rendered those holes very ineffective for ventilation. The inverted boat-like roof design was actually a trap for smoke to stay inside the house, and once it cooled, the soot would rain upon the floor like snow on Christmas. Now add in the farts and mess that their cattle produced. Fun fact, Vikings would keep the cattle in the same longhouse that they lived in. Vikings had a special bond with their farm animals. All the goats, horses, and cows would sleep right next to them. And there you have it, the perfect cocktail to asphyxiate yourself with carbon monoxide. Short-term exposure wasn't that bad for their health. The problem was the overexposure that Viking women and children endured for a good number of years. They would suffer from respiratory infections, bronchitis, cerebrovascular disease, and worst of all, cancer. Even if you are unaware of the legacy of Vikings, watching this video must have made it abundantly clear how much Vikings loved violence. And though one might assume that sports and recreational activities could be a good way to help them take a break from it, ironically their sports would make modern sports like UFC and the Super Bowl look like ballet. For instance, the Viking swimming race wasn't about swimming faster, but who could waterboard their opponent longer. Even innocent games like catch and tag could turn bloody any second, and it was considered extremely normal. Vikings' rules was that one can stop playing anytime they want, so if they stayed in the game long enough to get hurt, it'd be their own fault. Also, one should pray that a battle must end on the playing field, or it would cultivate into blood feuds that may last long enough to consume multiple generations. So, what do you think? Has your perception of Vikings changed? Do you want to play a little death tag? Tell us in the comments. When you think of Vikings, you probably think of fierce, seafaring warriors pulling up to coastal cities and wreaking havoc. History books are littered with terrifying accounts of Viking hordes ravaging and raiding, striking fear in the hearts of whoever was unlucky enough to get caught in their crosshairs. What might not come to mind when you think of the Vikings are lavishly dressed bodyguards serving the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. Welcome to Nutty Productions. Today, we're exploring the Varangians, the Viking Guards of Rome. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the actions of the subjects featured. The Varangian Guard was one of the most feared and well-trained guard units in world history. It was truly an international group of mercenaries. Danish, English, and Eastern European Vikings somehow coalesced to the Eastern Roman Empire in what would become Byzantium to form an elite fighting unit that was hugely influential in military operations in the East. The Varangian Guard lasted for more than 400 years. Traces of them have been found from Syria to Bulgaria and many places in between. The Varangian Guard represented a sort of nexus between East and West, where Scandinavian, English, Eastern European, and Mediterranean cultures met. From this perspective, the Guard was a harbinger of things to come. The world was shrinking, cultures intermingling, technologies developing either peacefully or otherwise. By the middle of the 9th century, the Vikings had, with the help of the Slavic, Finnish, and Baltic tribes of the region, formed a state called Kievan Rus. Now, debate swirls around whether or not it was the Vikings who established the Volga trade route or whether it was the Slavic tribes already inhabiting the region. Debate also swirls around the origins of the Rus state and the origins of the name itself. While Arab sources describe the Rus as Turkic, other sources describe them as very much Viking. One of the most widely circulated stories comes from a text called the Russian Primary Chronicle, a history compiled in Kiev by monks around the turn of the 12th century. According to the Chronicle, Kievan Rus was founded by a Viking named Oleg, who ruled Novgorod close to modern-day Estonia near the Baltic Sea. He quickly shifted the capital of Kiev, which he considered to be more strategically located. Oleg is described vaguely as a kinsman of a leader named King Rorik, whom he succeeded. Rorik is a figure shrouded in mystery. He apparently had journeyed to Novgorod in the 860s and was a key figure in establishing a Viking presence in the region. More evidence supporting the Viking founding of Kievan Rus comes from the name itself. Linguistically, Rus is thought to derive from Ruotsi, the Finnish word for Sweden. There are a couple of other interpretations of the origins of the word. It could be related to the Old Norse word for rowers, ropsmen, a nod to the style in which the Vikings traversed the inland rivers of the region. It could also be a nod to Roslagen, the Swedish home of King Rorik. Varangian derives from the Old Norse word meaning sworn companion and was used widely throughout Eastern Europe to refer to the giant intimidating warriors from Scandinavia. Under Oleg, the Varangians of Kievan Rus created a pretty formidable state that eventually set its sights on the riches of Byzantium. They began ransacking and pillaging lands around the capital, Constantinople, or modern-day Istanbul. The upstart Varangians pose as an outsized threat despite their relative lack of civilized infrastructure and manpower compared to the mighty Byzantines, who were at that point in time one of the most powerful empires in the world. According to the writings of Photius I, a leading Orthodox church in Constantinople around this time and a faithful man to God who eventually became a saint, the Varangians were a dreadful bolt fallen on us out of the farthest north, a thick, sudden hailstorm of barbarians who had burst forth. The Byzantines, the Vikings of the East, were nothing to mess with. Oleg and his warriors were playing with fire, though. Byzantium had a lot more resources and a military machine that was far more powerful. Yet instead of using it, the Byzantines decided on diplomacy and religious conversion instead. After successive Varangian attacks on the rural outskirts of Constantinople, Byzantine Emperor Leo IV sent missionaries into Kievan Rus instead of soldiers. Oleg and Leo agreed to a treaty called the Roman-Rus Treaty. It included a naval pact that guaranteed Rus's protection of Byzantine ships along waterways and vice versa. It also created a strong military alliance and allowed the Varangian warriors to serve in the Byzantine military and reap the lucrative spoils of war that came from fighting in one of the world's most powerful military machines. It was a powerful alliance. Almost before the ink had dried on the Treaty of 9/11, more than 700 Varangians joined up with the Byzantine forces to help invade Crete. The whole thing was part of a larger Byzantine effort to deal with the strengthening tide of northern barbarians descending upon the Mediterranean for the past 800 years. Invasions from the Germanic tribes like the Goths had plagued Rome from as early as 100 AD, and they eventually helped contribute to its downfall. By the time of Byzantium, the Rome we think of as Rome had already split into East and West, and the West had basically fallen apart into warring city-states. What was left was in the east, modern-day Turkey, Greece, Bulgaria, and parts of Syria and the Levant. The Eastern Roman Empire, which has since been referred to as Byzantium by historians to distinguish it from the Latin-speaking Roman Empire centered around the city of Rome in the west, was able to stick around for longer in part because of smart foreign policy moves like the treaty with the Varangians of Kievan Rus. Much has been written about the Viking conquest in northwest Europe. They invaded and conquered England for a time, took parts of France, expanded into Iceland and Greenland, and possibly even touched down in northeast Canada hundreds of years before Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in the year 1492. What's not so often talked about is the Viking expansion eastward. Beginning in the 9th century, they started pressing eastward from the Baltic Sea and then down through modern-day Poland, Russia, and Ukraine, using river networks to snake their way down into the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. They were eventually able to make contact with the wealthy, culturally rich civilizations of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Sassanid Empire in modern-day Iran, and the Abbasid Caliphate on the Arabian Peninsula. The route, called the Volga Trade Route after the Volga River, which winds from northeast Russia down into the Caspian Sea, was just one part of a wildly extensive web of rivers snaking through Eastern Europe, from Scandinavia down into Germany and Poland, down into the Balkans, over into Western Russia, and down through Ukraine and into the Black Sea. Viking ingenuity, with their incredible boat-building skills and ability to navigate just about anywhere, including using logs to row their ships across land if need be, allowed them to traverse these waterways at a time when it probably seemed impossible. By 980, Vladimir I, also known as Vlad the Great, had risen to power in Kievan Rus and began making moves that the new Byzantine emperor, Basil II, didn't like. In 988, Vladimir and his Varangian forces took the Crimean town of Chersonesus, a hop, skip, and jump away from the Byzantine capital, Constantinople. Basil, meanwhile, was dealing with internal uprisings amongst his own generals. Two of them in particular, Bardos Skleros and Bardos Phokas, had begun staging rebellions and were threatening to usurp the throne. Basil needed help. In another tactical diplomatic move, he struck up an agreement with Vladimir and the Northerners. Vlad would marry Basil's sister Anne, and in exchange, Vlad would dispatch more than 6,000 Varangian warriors to help the Byzantine emperor defend his crown against his rogue generals and their rebel forces. It was an unprecedented agreement for the times. No barbarian from the north had ever married into Byzantine royalty. One of the only reasons this was ever able to happen was because Vladimir had also agreed to be baptized and convert to Christianity. Vladimir, and much of the rest of Kievan Rus, had long been pagan. However, the Rus leader had already been shopping around for a new state religion before his allegiance with Basil and the Byzantines. Vladimir saw the adoption of different religions as a tactical move. It was common practice among a lot of the Norse rulers during the Viking Age. They were pretty open-minded when it came to religion, and many of them began converting to Christianity as a strategic way to exert more power and influence as they expanded eastward from Scandinavia. Vladimir sent envoys to different regions to get a sense of their religions and flirted with the monotheistic ones, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. He took the fact that the Jews had lost Jerusalem as a sign that God had forsaken them, so Judaism was out. Islam didn't appeal to him because of its prohibition of alcohol. Vlad was apparently quoted as saying that drinking is the joy of all Rus. We cannot exist without that pleasure. His envoys were awestruck by Hagia Sophia, Constantinople's majestic Christian cathedral. The Christians also liked their wine. It was a perfect match. After Vladimir's marriage to Basil's sister, their alliance was solidified and the era of the Varangian Guard had begun. The Varangian Guard became a permanent staple in the Byzantine courts, where they served the emperor without hesitation. They were instrumental in helping the empire maintain control of its territories and had amassed a ton of warrior reputation and struck fear in the hearts of anyone who they went up against. After Basil II's death in 1032, the Guard began to change. Many of them had become pretty wealthy. They were all paid and held up by Byzantine royalty as elite soldiers who deserved to be compensated for their loyalty and skill. The prospect of wealth and honor that became synonymous with the Varangian Guard began attracting Norsemen from far and wide. Some notable Varangian Guardsmen included Harald Hardrada, a Norwegian who became so rich serving the Guard that he went on to become the King of Norway. There was also a guy named Bali Bollason, an Icelander who returned home in such lavish clothing and jewelry that his countrymen gave him the nickname Bali the Elegant. The guardsmen were apparently able to amass so much wealth due to a weird law that allowed them to clean out the emperor's treasury whenever he died or was replaced. And this happened pretty frequently over the years. In the 100 years after Basil II's death in 1032, there was, on average, a new emperor every 7 years. Eventually, even Anglo-Saxons got in on the action. Many warriors had been forced out of England when it was conquered by the Normans in 1066. And they found a new home amongst the rank of the Varangian Guard in Constantinople. By the beginning of the 12th century, the power and fearsomeness of the Varangian Guard began to diminish. The key event that led to their eventual demise and the eventual demise of the entire Byzantine Empire was the sacking of Constantinople in 1204. The Fourth Crusade, a Western European coalition of Catholic soldiers amassed by Pope Innocent III, was on its way to try and capture Jerusalem when they took a detour and betrayed their fellow Christians by sacking the city. Constantinople and Byzantium would eventually recover, but the empire was a shell of its former self, and so were the Varangian Guards. Their roles shifted from fierce warriors to idling guards who stood guard around the city's palaces and prisons. In 1453, the Ottomans defeated the Byzantine Empire for good, and with it, the era of the Varangian Guard was finished. They served Constantinople faithfully for nearly 500 years. They represented a cultural melting pot of East and West, and they helped to change the course of history for one of the world's greatest empires.
Often regarded as savages, heathens, and barbarians, Vikings were mostly a sophisticated and civilized society defying the expectations of contemporary Europeans who considered them nothing but a menace. However, Vikings' victims were not entirely wrong about them. There was a lot of nutty and messed up stuff going on that was considered normal in the Viking Age.
Welcome to Nutty Productions.
And today, let's find out what creepy things were normal in the Viking Age. Slavery wasn't invented by the Vikings, but they sure did take it to another level of sadism. Owning the European sailing waters, Vikings were invading the shores of other nations in their tremendous but terrifying longboats and creating a network of the slave trade. According to historians, Vikings had their entire economy thriving on selling and buying slaves. Ireland was particularly a favorite spot for raiding among Vikings. Cities like Dublin and Limerick actually began as Viking slave trade hubs. For centuries, Vikings used these ports to ship the loot they gathered, plundering and pillaging the rest of Ireland, Britain, and France. Thanks to pop culture today, it's a common myth that Vikings targeted monasteries specifically for their riches, or they considered Christianity an inferior religion to their own. While they didn't have any strong feelings toward other religions, and of course the treasure of the monastery was a bonus to the raid, the primary objective was raiding monasteries was always monks. Why were Vikings after religious men, you ask? Because they were literate and usually prone to subjugation. This made them the perfect candidate for slavery. Also, obviously, they were supposed to be castrated. You can't really blame the Vikings for that, as eunuch slaves were in demand back in Byzantine and the Middle East in those days. In the Eastern Roman Empire and the Middle East, eunuchs were considered the perfect candidate for jobs such as teachers, harem guards, administrative roles on various levels, and palace servants. High demand from the East and the easy supply by Vikings elevated Mediterranean slave trade to an industrious level. For Vikings, these monasteries were like the source of raw material, which would yield high profits for them. All they had to do was go on a raid, grab some subservient monks who were already trained in the service of God, and ship them to Venice, where they would be castrated and sold to their Eastern masters. They also kept a few of these slaves for themselves. You might remember Athelstan from the Viking series, who was a slave. He served Ragnar Lodbrok, who in turn showed kindness and considered Athelstan a friend. However, in real life, Vikings weren't always as kind with slaves as Ragnar was with Athelstan. A disturbing discovery has confirmed that not only did Vikings keep slaves, but they also liked to take them along in the afterlife as well. Just like the Mesopotamian kings, Vikings had rituals to sacrifice the slaves on their master's demise so they can accompany them to the graves. Oddly, slaves were not only sacrificed by decapitation, but they were also buried without their heads. It is believed that Vikings did so to differentiate the master and the slaves. And one could wonder if Vikings did so to make sure slaves wouldn't rat out the abuse of Odin on reaching Valhalla with their masters. Vikings had a different kind of relationship with their animals. The average Viking family could not afford a barn, so it wasn't irregular to enter their longhouse and find them laying there with their pigs and their cows and the rest of the cattle. Vikings also loved their pets, and not only did they let their cats, dogs, and bears sleep in the bed with them, they would also take them on raids. Wait a second. Did the script say bears? Bears? Huh? On a slow day during the raids, Vikings would like to go in the wild and raid bear dens to abduct their cubs. They would bring them back home and raise these cubs as house bears. Now, as crazy and wild as it sounds, pet bears were quite useful for keeping slaves in line and protecting the cattle. Of course, that doesn't negate the dangers of having a giant wild animal roaming almost free in a civilization, so a lot of Viking settlements would levy heavy fines on the family that owned a bear, or they would outright ban them. Still, some families would risk having them no matter what. Based on Viking sagas and generational stories, it is believed that Vikings had to assemble at Uppsala every 9 years to conduct a festival in a bid to please the gods. And obviously, to please the Vikings gods, they had to make sacrifices.
At Uppsala, 99 men, horses, dogs, and hawks were sacrificed every 9 years to please the chief deity, Odin. It was believed in Norse mythology that to gain the wisdom of the whole universe, Odin once sacrificed himself to himself. He did that by plucking out his eye and throwing it in Mimir's well, shoving his spear Gungnir in his belly in a ritualistic way, and then hanged himself to Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 days and 9 nights. There's more to this story, but this channel is about the history and not mythology, so we digress, but now you know why 9 was considered a sacred number for Vikings. Vikings at Uppsala will sacrifice humans, horses, dogs, and hawks in a set of 9 and hang them from the trees of the holy grave to recreate the sacrifice of Odin to please him. It is believed in modern pop culture that these sacrificial humans were adult volunteers who would willingly walk up to the sacrificial altar to die. They did so to get a special place in Valhalla in the afterlife. However, both sagas and archaeological findings tell us that the truth was way darker than religious conditioning. According to historian Harry Brown, there are no actual sources to implement that the sacrificial people at Uppsala were volunteering. Moreover, disturbingly, archaeological excavations at a sacrificial site have revealed that most sacrifices were children under the age of 10. Further, a historical record from the 10th century by Ibn Fadlan told the story of a slave girl who tried to refuse to be sacrificed. This angered the Vikings surrounding her, and she was assaulted by at least 6 men, and they dragged her to the altar for her execution. Records of Viking households indicate that boys often outnumbered girls by a huge margin. On average, a common Viking house may have 4 male children for every 1 female child. In worst cases, the ratio may exaggerate to 9-to-1 in favor of the boys. Surely you must be thinking that's not how human biology works, or was there something special about the Viking gene that they mostly produced manly men? Well, legends can be deceiving, and so was the case with this mystery as well. Vikings gave birth to both male and female babies all the time without much difference, but a child wasn't considered a kid to the parent until it was named. The modern ceremony of naming or christening a child in the Western world comes from the Vikings, who had a ritual for the same called Alsavatni. A child was welcomed into the family only after receiving its name in the ceremony. So that left wiggle room for the parents to abandon the baby if they didn't wish to keep it, and usually girls drew the shorter stick. Yes, it is as horrible as it sounds. Before Alsavatni, parents would quality check their child for any deformities, curse, illness, or weakness to make the decision about keeping it. Sadly, gender could be considered such a weakness. This was no different than the ancient practices of chucking the baby followed in Mesopotamia and Sparta. However, once Alsavatni was performed, a child was now the responsibility of its parents, and any attempt to get rid of it could get them in trouble with the Viking law. Viking raids were no different than any other battle in the history of humans. To do the pillaging, raiding, and kidnapping, a Viking had to do lots and lots of violence along with many unspeakable things. Clearly, that sort of experience will leave a mark on the psyche, no matter what sort of upbringing and mental strength one had. So, when they return home with a medieval version of shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder, it wasn't easy to turn the crazy off and become a normal father, husband, and farmer. It was an everyday ordeal, and Nordic civilians had to come up with methods to help them cope and rehabilitate. One might assume that sports and recreational activities could be a good way to help them cope, but ironically, even sports were a health hazard in Nordic society. For instance, the Viking swimming race wasn't about swimming faster, but who could waterboard their opponent longer. Even innocent games like catch and tag could turn bloody any second, and it was considered extremely normal. The Vikings' ruling was that one can stop playing anytime they want, so if they stay in the game long enough to get hurt, it's their own fault. To think of it, it's getting clearer why Vikings had trouble getting over PTSD. According to Dr. Taryn Wills of the University of Aberdeen, the problem of PTSD became so severe for Viking settlements that the Viking Sagas were not just written to glorify Vikings, but also to warn the future Vikings of what fate was waiting for them in adulthood. What do you think a Viking would find creepy about our modern society? Or do you think we missed any creepy stuff in this video? Tell us in the comments. One may think words like law and order do not apply to scruffy barbarians of the North who murdered, plundered, and pillaged the rest of Europe without any conscience in the Middle Ages. Hard to believe, but Vikings did have an intricate and sophisticated law system back in the day. But beware, for the Viking punishment was all one can imagine, as their justice could be unforgiving.
Welcome to Nutty Productions.
And today, let's find out what were the merciless and cruel punishments that Vikings used in their time. In modern times, humans have well-defined distinctions when it comes to the act of killing, such as premeditated murder, intentional murder, and manslaughter. But back in the Viking Age, the line wasn't drawn so impeccably clear. According to the Viking law, killing somebody covertly and without fair warning was considered a despicable and monstrous act, while killing someone in a duel after challenging them in public was considered honorable. Even in the case of manslaughter or accidental killings, one had to take responsibility for the killing and not flee. Obey the counsel and pay the compensation imposed on you. The same applied to homicides resulting from fights or similar situations. However, if one was caught murdering someone in their sleep, by surprise or without fair warning, chances were high they might be asked to do the fatal walk. This punishment was reserved mostly for high-profile murders, as was the case in Broddir in Jarl's Saga. In the fatal walk, the executioner would slice the prisoner's belly open, and the prisoner would be asked to walk to the spot of his execution with their guts spilling out. Even if guts or intestines are removed from the body of a person, they somehow manage to stay alive for hours, albeit in a very agonizing way. On arriving at the spot of execution, which was commonly a tree, the spilling guts of the prisoner would be pulled out to tie them around the tree. If the prisoner was fortunate, they might die during this ordeal, or else more agony awaited as death may take its sweet time. Medieval Nordic people are more commonly referred to as Vikings in pop culture. They do not have a very sophisticated and civilized image in present times. Often depicted as savages, Scandinavians were quite a complex society with a nearly well-defined judiciary system. There was no police system, but they did have the Thing.
The Thing.
The Thing, or a Thing, was the governing assembly at the local level to sort out disputes, punish crimes, maintain peace, or shall we say keep control over violence. During the Thing, which was held periodically, all free men of the Vikings would gather in their communities to enforce law. Each Thing had a law speaker who would recite the law from memory. The law speaker and the local chieftain would judge and settle the cases of dispute they heard, although all free men of the community had a say. However, things were most likely dominated by a local powerful family or families, so the more influence you had in the community, the more weight your words had during the Thing. Also, the Thing led by the king was called Althing. Now, before talking about how a Thing functioned, it is important to understand that in the Viking Age, taking responsibility for one's own actions was considered supreme. If one did something wrong, they had to admit to the deed. One could only defend themselves at the Thing, which was the honorable way in Nordic society. This was a reason why theft was considered a more heinous crime than, say, murder, which is considered one of the biggest law violations in modern times. In their customs, theft was considered a dishonorable offense, with treacherous and conspicuous intentions, while killing somebody in the open was an honorable thing. So technically, one had a better chance of getting away with cutting a throat rather than cutting a purse. Unfortunately, as Vikings considered any form of writing except runes lame, their records of social and political conduct are based on sagas. The oral literature is based on events that were passed on from generation to generation. So consider taking these punishments with a pinch of skepticism. According to these sagas, if one was caught stealing, he better hope to be killed for it. It was less painful than being punished the other way. There was no uniform code for capital punishments among the Vikings. Sometimes things would work like a kangaroo court, and villagers would raise the gallows to hang the guilty until death or simply chop one's head off. Executions in Nordic law were used in the rarest of cases, but hanging was more common than beheading, which was mostly considered as a means of execution for slaves. But these were more like guidelines than law. These were quick ways to kill the culprit, but were also regarded as the most embarrassing way to die. It was so because of the Nordic belief about Valhalla and how one should always die in battle with a weapon in hand to get an honorable seat on Odin's table in the afterlife. A thief would never get to see Valhalla at the end of the tunnel, and most possibly end up in Niflheim, the realm of evil and death ruled by hell. However, if the Thing decided to punish the thief the other way, one might get to experience Niflheim while being alive itself. Introducing the hung meat. Mentioned in the Hrafnkel saga Freisengode, the hung meat can be considered to have the greatest plausibility as a physical act of vengeance. Pretty sure you, the audience, even if you are a vegan, must have visited a butcher shop in your life, or at least peruse its contents through the window passing by. Now you may be able to picture why this punishment was called the hung meat. It's exactly what it sounds like. The meat is hung by its rear tendons using hooks in a butcher shop. Like it was in the Hrafnkel's case, would be hung by a rope upside down. The only difference is that the carcasses of dead animals in butcher shops are dead, while the culprits who suffered this punishment in Scandinavia were still alive and mostly lived through this ordeal. Instead of tying their ankles with a rope, administrators of punishment would use the knives to pierce holes through the victim's heels behind their tendons to pass the rope and then pull it over a beam to string them up. After the duration of punishment would be over, the guilty would be cut down and declared an outlaw by the Thing. All of their property would be forfeited and divided into the community. Even though the punishments mentioned in this video were used by Vikings in the rarest of cases, they had a special punishment reserved for the rarest of the rarest case, the Blood Eagle. The most known instance of Blood Eagle execution is related to famed Viking King Ragnar Lothbrok. After Ragnar was captured and killed by King Aella of Northumbria, England, his sons invaded Northumbria, seeking revenge. After Northumbria fell, Ragnar's son Ivar the Boneless condemned Aella to the horrible fate of the Blood Eagle. Today, modern scholars debate how Vikings performed this ritual torture, and some don't even want to believe that the gruesome method of the ritual was even preferred at all. You can't blame them for the process of the Blood Eagle. It is indeed so cruel and grisly that one would like to doubt it ever happened. But whether fetishizing fiction or repulsive reality, the Blood Eagle ritual was a fate you would not even hope for your enemies. The victim's hands and legs were strangled to prevent escape or sudden movements. The person seeking vengeance would then stab the victim with an axe by their tailbone and up towards the rib cage, meticulously separating every rib from the backbone. The victim would be left having their internal organs on full display. The gruesome process was carried out while making sure the victim stays alive to endure the pain. To make it worse, Vikings would then rub salt on the gaping wound. No, that was not a metaphor. Actual saline simulant would be applied to the wound to enhance the torment. Then the detached ribs would spread out like giant fingers so that the vengeance seeker would have easy access to the victim's organs so they can pull the lungs out and make the victim appear as if they had a pair of wings spread out on their back. Therefore the name Blood Eagle. There were two main reasons Vikings used the Blood Eagle on their victims. First, they believed it was a sacrifice to Odin, father of the Norse pantheon of gods and the god of war. Second, and more plausibly, was that the Blood Eagle was done as a punishment to honor lacking individuals. According to the Orkneyinga saga of the Vikings, Halfdan was defeated in a battle at the hands of Earl Einar, who then tortured him with a Blood Eagle as he conquered Halfdan's kingdom. Similarly, Aella was tortured in vengeance. So we leave you with the question, do you think Blood Eagle and other such Viking punishments were works of fiction, or do the scrupulous details in the description have a shred of truth behind them? Let us know in the comments.
When you think Viking, what comes to mind? Invaders, raiders, pillagers, covered in face paint, tattoos with reverse mullets, and brandished weapons? What about the guy with the grocery list getting yelled at for not picking up the milk?
I've listened to you for the last
Didn't think so.
20 minutes.
Today on Nutty History, welcome to the lives and marriages of real Vikings who farmed more than they fought. Every marriage begins with a wedding, and Norse weddings began with a contract. Marriages among Vikings weren't just about two lovebirds starting a new family, but creating a lasting bond between two existing families. The alliance was built on a lot of negotiations between the two families, and most marriages were arranged by the elders. Back then, a suitable age for marriage was considered 12 to 15. So according to old Scandinavians, these kids were good enough to marry, but not good enough to choose their partners themselves. Representatives from both families would meet to talk bride price, dowry, support in war and peace, and inheritance. Sometimes these negotiations could take up to a year or two. For raiders, the Norse had some pretty strict legal guidelines. For the groom, the preparation came with a task. He was required to break into the grave of an ancestor and retrieve their sword.
This tradition marked the death of his boyhood and his rebirth as a man. Afterwards, he was taken to a bathhouse with the other men, to the first bath with hot water, where the goal was to sweat enough before diving into cold water to get clean. After that, it doesn't matter much what he wore for the wedding, but his hair had to be decorated and carry a symbol of Thor, the god of lightning, along with his ancestors' weapon. The bride followed the same bath ritual, but in a separate bathhouse with married female family members. But before her bath, she was supposed to remove cransen, a circlet that symbolized her virginity among other marks of her maidenhood. These belongings were then stored in a box so that she can hand them over to her daughter one day. For brides again, the attire wasn't too important, but she had to wear the bridal crown of the family, with flowers and crystals decorating her hair. A wedding license and an ordained minister are hard to get even these days. Vikings faced difficulties too in securing Gathi, the priest who would perform the wedding ceremony. Before the wedding ceremony, Gathi would perform some pretty bloody rituals to appease the god. Depending on which god the Gathi meant to appease, they'd sacrifice an animal in front of everybody. They'd use the meat for a feast and dribble the blood on the god statue on Gathi's forehead. The Gathi would take even more of that blood and spray the couple with it as a god's blessing, which is a lot to take in. But just like today, the Viking wedding ceremony was mostly about exchanging promises and vows among the new couple, along with rings, but also family swords, which they got to keep. Family and friends were also required to attend as witnesses. And after the feasting and drinking that followed the wedding, witnesses were required to make sure that the bride and the groom consummate the marriage, to enforce the validity of their union. At least 6 people were required to supervise the couple. Keep that in mind next time anybody complains about a lack of privacy for newlyweds. Vikings had a male-dominant society, but Viking women enjoyed more rights and freedom than the rest of contemporary Europe. Most women were housewives in the Viking Age, with only a small percentage of the women accompanying Viking raids. The women's life was centered around the home and the farm, preparing food, taking care of laundry, milking cows, sheep, and goats, and a myriad of other household tasks took up most of their day. They also made clothing. It would take a Viking woman 35 hours to spin enough yarn for a day's weaving, to give you some idea. Having kids brought on a whole other set of challenges. There were no schools available in the old Viking Age, so it was the parents' job to prepare and educate their kids for adult life. Daughters were taught by their mothers, sisters, and aunts, all household tasks. Everything from sewing, weaving, to how to manage a household. Sons, on the other hand, followed their fathers, brothers, and uncles to learn farming, as well as the art of fighting like a Viking. Kids of both genders were asked to take this training seriously from a very young age, and they were supposed to be proficient by the age of 10. Women had the right to ask for divorce, just like men, and they could also reclaim dowry on successful divorces. However, Viking men had free reign over adultery, with the ability to have multiple mistresses, while women weren't allowed to do anything behind their husband's back. However, they could demand a divorce on the grounds of their husband not being sexually satisfying, but they were not allowed to get involved anywhere else until the divorce was final. The punishment for adultery grew harsher with the introduction of Christianity among Vikings, which included public thrashing as well as the death penalty. A man was allowed to kill his wife and her lover on sight if he caught them red-handed. That being said, domestic violence was actually frowned upon amongst Vikings. In fact, a man who raised his hand on his wife was shamed and humiliated in society. Women were allowed to leave their husbands if the abuse happened 3 or more times. There was a sense of ownership over each other in Viking marriages. The husband owned their wives. The wives equally owned husbands too. That is why if a husband brought a mistress home, the mistress had to listen and obey the wife at all costs. It was a different age, but some things about marriages never change. Vikings were made of different ilk, when it came from working from dawn to dusk to feed their families, protecting the home from bandits and natural disasters, raising and educating their kids, and at the same time enjoying marriages to the fullest in their own way. What do you think? Would you ever marry a Viking if you had the chance? Tell us in the comments.
Viking history is packed full of action, warriors, battles, rage-inducing plants, hoard offerings, battle lust, and plenty of raiding and pillaging. Yet we have to take their history with a grain of salt. Most of it wasn't written down until a couple of hundred years after the Viking Age, which lasted from around 800 until 1066 AD. Legendary figures like Ragnar Lothbrok may or may not have actually existed, and lineages and events can often be hard to pinpoint. Netflix's show, Vikings Valhalla, tells part of this history in all its grim glory. What actually happened, and what's just been made up for compelling storytelling? Welcome to Nutty Productions. Today, we're taking a look at what Netflix got wrong and right about the Vikings. Vikings Valhalla picks up 200 years after Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons tormented England and France with raid after raid. Events portrayed in the History Channel's hugely popular show, Vikings, a show that also blends a good amount of fact and fiction, despite airing on the History Channel. But hey, it's the same channel that features this guy broing out about ancient aliens. Anyway, the fact that Vikings Valhalla is on Netflix has maybe allowed the show to stray a bit farther from the historical record, mixing up timelines and creating characters out of thin air. The plot of the first season of the show centers around the Viking invasion of England and a quest for revenge by the Norwegian prince Harald Sigurdsson after his brother and a whole host of other Vikings living in England in a region known as the Danelaw were wiped off the earth by the forces of the English King Ethelred in an event called the St. Brice's Day Tragedy. All of these characters did actually exist. The St. Brice's Day Tragedy did actually happen. And the Vikings did actually invade England. But there are some serious problems with the who, what, when, where, and why of it all. First of all, the St. Brice's Day tragedy of the Vikings in England happened in 1002 AD. Harald Sigurdsson, played by the almost too handsome Leo Suter in the show, despite looking like this on Norse coins. So dreamy. Sorry, where are we at right now? Oh yeah, right. So Harald Sigurdsson wasn't even born yet when the St. Brice's Day tragedy happened. Harald came into the world in 1015 AD. His brother was Olaf, King of Norway, and he did have some pretty wild adventures in his lifetime, but it's hard to get revenge if you're not alive. Then in the show, King Cnut of Denmark helps lead the invasion of Vikings forces into England to help Harald, again not born yet, avenge the death of his kinsman on St. Brice's Day. In reality, though, it was Cnut's father, Sven Forkbeard, who was seeking revenge for St. Brice's Day and invaded the island. Forkbeard's sister had apparently met her demise at the hands of the English, and the Danish king was less than pleased. According to Viking history, again a fairly shaky one at times, Cnut most likely joined his father on multiple invasions of England over the next decade, which culminated in a Viking victory as the English king Ethelred and his son Edmund fled to Normandy in 1013 AD. Sven thus became the first Viking king of England. Sort of. Sven died just a few months after capturing London. With Ethelred and his son Edmund still alive in Normandy, the English crown was basically up for grabs. The Vikings in Danelaw proclaimed Cnut the King of England, while most of the other English lords still recognized Ethelred as king. Ethelred eventually came back from exile and forced Cnut to retreat back to Denmark in the spring of 1014. Vikings Valhalla depicts Cnut as the King of Denmark throughout the first season. It also has his father Sven entering the picture after Cnut becomes King of England. In reality, Cnut wasn't the king of anything before St. Brice's Day, and he still wasn't the king of anything even after his father's death. The Danish crown went to his older brother Harald. No, not that Harald. This Harald, officially known as Harald II of Denmark. He served as king while his brother Cnut built up another fleet and then headed back to England to finish what his father started. Cnut did finish what his father started. With a large coalition of Viking forces from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, he invaded England in 1015 AD,
and in 1017 he was crowned the King of England. Cnut then went back up to Denmark, where his brother Harold subsequently died under mysterious circumstances. Could it have been just bad timing, or could it have been planned? Either way, in 1018, Cnut became the King of England and Denmark. Now what happened next could potentially ruin some of the suspense in the upcoming seasons of the show, but hey, it is still history, and it did still already happen. So if you want to check out Nutty History's full biography of Cnut, hit the link and save it for later. The two main characters of Vikings Valhalla are Leif Erikson and his sister Freydis Eriksdatter. They're the offspring of Eric the Red, hence the surnames Erikson and Eriksdatter. Eric was exiled from Iceland for unnecessary deaths he caused and ended up leading the settlement of Greenland. There is absolutely no evidence that Leif and Freydis ever journeyed to Norway or Sweden, and nothing about them ever participated in the Viking invasions of England. What is written about them, though, is compelling in its own right. A lot of what we know about Leif and Freydis come from the Vinland Sagas. Now, to make things more confusing, they were written in Iceland. Vinland is a mysterious place that many historians think could have been North America. The sagas say that first Leif ventured west from Greenland to explore the Vinland, but after staying a winter or two, ended up returning. Then Leif's sister, Freydis, made the voyage with a guy named Thorfinn Karlsefni. When they hit land, they set up camp at the settlement that Leif had started, possibly in Canada, and then proceeded to make natives mad, whom many believe were Native Americans. But, depending on which saga you read, Freydis could either be a heroine or a cold-hearted lady. In one saga, she bravely fights off the Native Americans while she's pregnant. But in another, Freydis is a brutal conspirator who ended up ending many of her own people after a couple of harsh winters in this strange land. Either way, in the sagas, Freydis is a powerful warrior that no one wants to mess with, which the shows portray perfectly. One of the primary points of conflict in Vikings Valhalla is the one between the Christians and pagans. The show is set up as some kind of supreme battle between those who worship many gods and those who just worship one. The Vikings of Netflix are torn between Christianity and the paganism of Norse religion, and it leads to a ton of death, both amongst the Vikings and between the Vikings and the English. The St. Brice's Day tragedy is played up in the series as a kind of ethnic cleansing that pits the Christians against the pagans. Now, while this may have a bit of truth, the event probably had more to do with the fact that Ethelred and the English nobility were pretty tired of having to pay all these taxes to the Vikings and Danelaw in exchange for not having their heads taken by the Norsemen. The Christian-pagan conflict wasn't really as cut and dry as the show portrays it. Now, to be fair, characters like Leif and Harold display a kind of back-and-forth wavering between paganism and Christianity that probably rings truest to historical fact. The truth is, as the Vikings expanded farther south and east into Europe, many of them converted to Christianity, but many of them did it more out of pragmatism than deep spirituality. It was economically useful to accept the one true God as your Lord and Savior. Lots of Vikings converted to Christianity because it helped the trade relations and allowed them to marry into Christian kingdoms and expand their influence. The truth was that many Vikings simply added the Christian capital G god to the pantheon of gods that they already worshipped. Evidence of this was found in Denmark, where a smith mold was found that had spaces for both the Christian cross and Thor's hammer, so the blacksmith could cater to both Christian and pagan clientele. Still though, Christian missionaries were pretty relentless in their pursuit of covering as many Vikings as possible. It did lead to some conflicts, but not in a widespread way that it's portrayed in the show. It was, for the most part, a peaceful, slow process. Every good story needs an antagonist. Often it comes in the form of an evil person who wants to destroy instead of create. In Vikings Valhalla, that person is Jarl Korra. Korra is a radical Christian Viking whose sole purpose seems to be purging Scandinavia of all pagans. He takes out plenty of innocents in the sacred village and temple of Uppsala. That's a real place where Vikings did go to pray and sacrifice to the gods. He then teams up with Olaf Haraldsson, himself a devout Christian, to march on Kattegat, a city that, despite being depicted as a city in both Viking shows, is actually a 12,000 square mile of sea between Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. Olaf Haraldsson was in fact a devout Christian in the historical record. He became known as Saint Olaf after Pope Alexander III canonized him in 1164, a little over 100 years after his death. Jarl Kåre, on the other hand, is an entirely made-up character. There's no mention of him in any historical records and was used to stir up drama between the Christian-pagan dynamic. One thing that the show does get right, and something that is often overlooked in Viking lore, is the fact that the Vikings were a pretty diverse group of people. They traveled all over the place, making it as far east as Constantinople and as far south as northern Africa. As a result, there was a mixing of cultures and people in Scandinavia that many people don't realize. Scandinavia around this time has been called a global North Atlantic, and while the name connotes a type of utopian pluralism, it was far from that, filled with much hate and violence, but it was diverse. The idea of the global North Atlantic was portrayed in the show through the character Jarl Håkon, the ruler of Kattegat. She's a woman of color who in the first episode explains her African Scandinavian descent and how she came to be the Jarl of Kattegat. Her character is apparently based loosely on Håkon Sigurdsson, despite the historical Håkon being a man and a Jarl in Norway. He was, however, the last pagan ruler of Norway and resisted attempts by Christian Vikings to convert everyone to Christianity in much the same way the fictional female Håkon did in the show. History is often a fuzzy thing. The history of the Vikings is one that combines legend with fact, and as a result, it makes more sense that dramatized accounts like the Viking series play with timelines and add characters to create a cohesive and entertaining story. What do you think will happen in Season 2 of Vikings Valhalla? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. The Vikings were many things: raiders, pillagers, traders, merchants, and craftsmen. But nobody thought of them as a conquering society until they laid their eyes on England. Although many had tried, the Vikings were the only ones to successfully conquer England, and they conquered it twice. The first of these conquests lasted for over a century and became the stuff of legends in the Norse sagas. Did Ragnar Lodbrok perish in the snake pits of Northumbria? Were the sons of Ragnar real? What was the real motive behind the invasion of England by the great heathen army? Welcome to Nutty Productions, and today let's find out what happened to the Vikings who were the first to conquer England. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the actions of the subjects featured. June 8, 793. After traversing the North Sea for days, a group of seafarers from the north saw the holy island of Lindisfarne on the horizon. The island is just located off the coast of what was then Northumbria, one of 7 kingdoms that constituted the land we now know today as England. The Saxon writers had warned earlier in the year that bad times were coming for Northumbria. They saw omens of immense whirlwinds, flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. Interestingly, their imaginations weren't baseless. The ships of pagan Vikings caught unguarded Christian monasteries with utter surprise. What they left in their wake was a desecrated sanctuary of the Christian god at St. Cuthbert, dozens of deceased unarmed and defenseless saints and monks, and empty coffers, and thus began the Viking Age, the period in which modern England suffered the wrath of Scandinavian sailor warriors who first looted the land and then conquered it. The attack on Lindisfarne wasn't the first time Vikings had spilled blood on English soil. 4 years prior, 3 Viking ships landed in Wessex in 789 AD. It was reported that Vikings eliminated the king's reeve when he arrived to bring the strangers to the king's court. But Lindisfarne was an attack on the integrity of the 7 kingdoms of England. The island is called Holy Island because this was the very place Christianity began to spread on the English mainland. It is hard to say how much wealth Vikings gained by raiding Lindisfarne, but the artifacts found in Lindisfarne suggest these spiritual monks at St. Cuthbert were enjoying a substantial amount of materialistic wealth. This is evident by the discovery of the 1,200-year-old royal game piece at the Holy Island and the Lindisfarne Gospels, the reproduction of canonical Christian Gospels, both of which have cost the monastery a lot of coins. The wealth raided by the Vikings in 793 AD would have been worth tens of millions in today's economy. But the Vikings didn't just acquire wealth, they also abducted many of the monks that didn't perish in the invasion. This boosted their stocks of human servants, the major industry on which Vikings thrived. Christian monasteries became a lucrative target for Viking raiders, and in following decades after Lindisfarne, they plundered more and more English monasteries, as well as Scottish, Irish, and French monasteries. Eventually, they got bored of going back and forth for raids and decided to conquer England. In the long history of England, the country has only been conquered twice, despite there being many attempts, and both times the honor went to the Scandinavians, ancestors of modern Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The first to succeed were the semi-legendary Sons of Ragnar. Whether Ragnar Lodbrok was a real person or just a figment of the imagination of the writers of Norse sagas is up for debate. But the men who call themselves the Sons of Ragnar were perhaps real. According to the sagas, Ragnar Lodbrok was sentenced to death by King Ella of Northumbria, and that prompted his sons to amass a large army and launch an invasion. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles remember this invasion as the attack of the Great Heathen Army. The intimidating name given to the army of the Sons of Ragnar could have been misleading. The Great Heathen Army sounds like hundreds of thousands of Vikings sailing to the shores of England, but the number could have been far, far less. Minimalist historians claim that because Viking ships were incapable of holding more than 32 men at a time, the Vikings couldn't have an armada big enough to carry more than 1,000 warriors. However, the consensus among mainstream historians is that the Great Heathen Army was nearly 3,000 warriors strong, based on the accounts of various smaller invasions. However, it is also quite possible that the Great Heathen Army grew in numbers after landing in England. Different warrior groups that were perhaps related to different ship companies that had been raiding Ireland, France, and other locations may have joined the cause along the way. The army could have had non-Viking mercenaries as well. The Great Heathen Army landed on the Isle of Thanet in Kent in 1865. At this point in time, Viking raids were meant to be hit and run. Every time, the Vikings would make land, raid, and pillage, and would then depart with their coffers full. Now, if they stayed longer, they were paid to leave by English kings with a parting tribute called Danegeld. But in 865, the organized army wanted more than just Danegeld. They wanted all of England for themselves. The Vikings noticed during the incursion that the four kingdoms of Anglo-Saxons were prone to infighting and discourse. After raiding and pillaging Kent, despite the residents offering Danegeld, the Great Heathen Army spent winters in East Anglia, where they accepted the peace offerings of the natives in the form of horses. Now, with their new steeds, they marched north intending to take Northumbria and avenge their father's death, if sagas are to be believed. King Ella struck a deal with the former King Osbert to throw Vikings out of their lands. But despite early success, Vikings surrounded their forces, and both Ella and Osbert went down with nearly 4/5 of their forces, amounting to an estimated 4,000 or more deaths. The sagas, however, describe that Ella survived the battle and later was subjected to Blood Eagle by the Sons of Ragnar. If you don't know, Blood Eagle was a brutal way to go. Vikings initially replaced the form of King Ella with a puppet king, but later created the kingdom of Jorvik, centered on York. The Vikings then returned to East Anglia, and the kingdom tried to resist them, but the Scandinavians made short work of them. The king of East Anglia, Edmund the Martyr, was tied to a tree and met a fate full of arrows. The devastation of East Anglia was so severe that no records of Edmund's rule and sacrifice or the accounts of battle survived. Ivar's armies then pillaged churches and priories abound, and then they set their eyes on Wessex. Within a decade, all of England except for the Kingdom of Wessex had kneeled to the Norsemen. By now, the Danish warrior Guthrum was the then leader of the Great Heathen Army. He brought the Great Army himself from Denmark, and that strengthened the heathen cause further. Wessex was ruled by Ethelred then, and he put up a staunch defense against the Great Heathen Army. After many skirmishes, the conclusion of the annexation came down to the Battle of Ashdown. Vikings had an advantage in the battle, and they divided their army into two bands, with one side commanded by Halfdan and Bagseg, and the other commanded by their earls. Hearing about this, Ethelred and his younger brother Alfred too copied the strategy, and decided to play man-on-man defense. However, Ethelred refused to advance before finishing his prayers, and that left Alfred going at it alone in the battle with half of the army. The Danes mistook this move by Wessex as their last line of defense, and flanked Alfred's army with their other half. Despite hours of shield wall on shield wall struggle, Alfred's men held out against the entire Viking army until Ethelred joined the battle and surrounded the flanking army. The Great Heathen Army was routed and gave flight to the security of Reading, with many Viking warriors felled in the Wessex advance. 5 of their earls perished, and so was their king, King Bagsig. 3 months later, Ethelred passed unexpectedly and Alfred succeeded him. The great heathen army also turned to Mercia, meanwhile, and came one step closer to conquering all of England. They wintered in London and then decided to split in Repton, the location of Ivar the Boneless's grave. Halfdan took half of the army and left for Scotland, and Guthrum moved south again to finish what he started in Wessex. This brings us to the decisive and historical Battle of Edington. Both armies stood nearly 4,000 strong, and with every other Anglo-Saxon kingdom defeated, Alfred lost hope and had the support of the entire Anglo-Saxon population of England. At first, Alfred seemed to be yet another victim of the Viking invaders. His forces were decimated, and the king himself was reduced to the status of an outlaw, mounting guerrilla tactics against the Vikings. It's during this period that, according to legend, a disguised Alfred took shelter in a peasant woman's house, who asked him to look after a batch of bread she was baking, and then scolded the hapless king when he accidentally allowed them to burn. Eventually, Alfred gathered together an army of local men and met the Vikings in fierce combat. It turned out to be a resounding victory for the Anglo-Saxons. The great heathen's army lost more than 2,000 of their men and were forced to starve until they offered peace, along with Guthrum conceding and offering to be baptized, resulting in the Treaty of Wedmore. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum formalized and defined the boundaries of Viking and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Later, the culmination of Danish territories came to be known as Danelaw and established the Norse dominance in England. The clash between Anglo-Saxons and Norse redefined the landmass now called England, ethnically, politically, linguistically, and culturally. But this was just the beginning, as the Norse would not settle down until they gained hold of the entire England later under the leadership of Sweyn Forkbeard and Cnut. This would be the second and last conquest of the Vikings in England. Tell us in the comments if you know words that modern English borrowed from Old Norse. And if you enjoyed the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Nutty History videos. As always, thank you for watching Nutty History.